shelter of the land, and guardian angels sang the strain. Shall thou rise, forgetful from each foreign stroke, forgetful from each foreign stroke. As fell a blast, the blast that bears the skies, serves not to root thy native oak. With matchless beauty crowned, and manly hearts who guard the fair.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Today we have with us Supreme EmperorKizza, sort of a last-minute edition. We're going to have somebody else on this afternoon to discuss what we are going to be discussing. However, he had to drop out at the last minute, unfortunately. But either way, very glad to have Kizza on as a last-minute replacement. I think he'll be just as enlightening, this conversation. How are you doing? Well, it's evening for you, but how are you doing today, Supreme EmperorKizza?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
Okay. So you pretty much know the gist of what we're going to be talking about, right? I sent you the pretty much the the itinerary. Either way, so today we are going to be discussing, as the title suggests, UK politics and culture, specifically pertaining to what is going on right now in the UK. Kizza will be able to shed some light on that. I think this is a stream that will benefit, especially Americans here in the audience, because Americans pretty much only care about, we pretty much only care about our politics at the moment. We don't really, I mean, some of us are pretty much aware of what goes on in other countries, but those people are far and few between, it seems. So that's why we have a Kizza on today. I know a little bit personally about everything that's going on. However, Kizza, of course, being a limey, knows more than I do. But either way, again, thank you for coming on, Kizza.
No problem. My pleasure.
So, yes. So I think it's a good place to start by discussing, I guess, context, everything that's been going on over the past, I don't know, 50, the post-war era would probably be a good place to start, because I think there's a lot going on in the UK right now. I know. Actually, would you say, comparatively speaking, this is I guess this will be the first question. What would you say the difference is, at least in terms of the turmoil between in terms of the political and cultural sphere, so to speak, between between what's going on in the UK right now and what's going on in America. I know in a lot of ways the context between the two is vastly different, but in terms of upheaval, how would you say they compare? I guess on a scale from stable to cringe.
Well. I mean, honestly, if I could sum up British politics in one simple sentence, it is a disgusting, cringe-filled toilet that needs to be flushed.
Okay. Do you care to elaborate on that?
Well, right now, as of 2021, we currently have a quote-unquote conservative government, and I use that term very loosely, that seems to be doing almost everything in its power to conserve absolutely nothing of the country.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of the sense I'm getting from especially people on the British right. And when I say the British right, I don't mean like the quote unquote Sargon types. Because I mean, Sargon, love him or hate him, he is basically a liberal in the traditional sense, at least in the social democratic sense at worst.
Yeah. He seems to have shifted slightly more towards quote unquote a conservative perspective, considering that he's had kids, and that tends to happen when you embrace quote unquote dadism. The conservative aspect does start to pull you more to the right.
That's fair. I can totally see that, and I have definitely seen that before. And I also think it depends, and not in every case, but sometimes it depends on, I guess, your parents in a lot of respects. And I know this isn't like deterministic or anything, and I think this is generally overstated when people say this. But I've noticed generally people who are brought up in liberal households, at least in the U.S., a lot of times at least go nominally more to the right, and vice versa. Like my friend and I were just talking about the other day. He was raised in a pretty conservative household. I was raised in an apolitical household, for the most part, that ever since maybe the early 2010s or so became liberal after all this stuff started happening. And I was always pretty liberal growing up, like a default liberal, but I guess I wouldn't identify as a conservative, but I definitely moved more to the right compared to I don't place myself really particularly anywhere on the political spectrum, because the political spectrum is absolute bullshit. But like my friend and I were talking about how he moved more towards the left. I've moved more towards the right over the years. But yeah, either way, would you say that's kind of the same in Britain too?
Depends on who you ask. Like me personally, I just mostly wanted to be left alone in my younger years. Just wanted to be left alone, just to do my stuff, just to do what I needed to do. But sadly, people had to constantly get in the way, constantly scream very loudly about how we got to be moral about certain events and how you can't say this, you can't say that. And you just get so annoyed with it all that you just want to put this in. You just want to embrace the dark side and force choke all these people to death.
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, I can feel that.
Yeah, I mean that's why I joke and say that I should be supreme emperor of the island. And
yeah, we can get to that at the end. What your policy agenda is.
Well, I would say for anyone who really cares, really strap yourself in, because some of these ideas are utterly batshit.
Yeah. Crazy. Well, we had a pretty long conversation about that. I think it was after I went on British Knight's Current Crusade podcast. Yes. We had a discussion afterwards.
I do love British Knight. I mean, he does like me as well, especially how blunt I can be on certain subjects, and he does think I'm a little crazy, but he understands my perspective.
Yeah. Either way, though, so I guess to start, where would you align yourself politically, just so that the audience has a general sense of where you are?
Well, that's a bit tricky, because I have various positions which are, from what I understand, very unique in terms of the political sphere.
Okay.
So, for instance, economically speaking, I'm sort of, I guess you would say, a very aggressive Austrian in terms of Austrian economics, but that's with a quote unquote nationalist lens.
Okay, fair enough. Speaking. Well, what about like protectionism? What's your take on that? Is when I think like nationalists, that is a lot of nationalists are themselves protectionists.
Well, I mean, I guess I could say my position is somewhat. I mean, I forget which term it is because I've heard both these terms being used. I guess you would say I am a supporter of it's either called national capitalism or economic nationalism. I've heard both terms. So I'm not sure which is correct and which one's the incorrect one. But basically,
like Austrian in the domestic sense as it relates to like the internal economy.
Yes, but also you are very aggressive sort of in terms of international economics in the sense that you impose very low corporate taxes to get loads of investment and also push for things. And also you are somewhat very aggressive, maybe not aggressively protectionist, but you're very clear about making other countries' lives a bit awkward when it comes to trade. You always want to come out the winner when it comes to international trade.
Okay, so like I'm guessing that's kind of your position on the continent in terms of competition and stuff, like competing with the continent.
I guess in a way, I sort of somewhat a lot of, let's say, somewhat of Trump's economic positions, I could definitely agree with in certain aspects.
Okay,
not all of it, but certain aspects.
Okay. Yeah. Either way, though, let's start by talking about, I guess, sort of the post-war consensus in the UK. So, I mean, everything, of course, we all know I know the British Empire had pretty much been in decline since World War I, and eventually the empire even started becoming a net drain to an extent on British GDP in general. But either way, then, of course, everything was relatively fine. It was still like the preeminent world power until 1940. And then, I mean, I've always said the British Empire, symbolically speaking, the British Empire ended on the beaches of France in 1940.
And you could argue that. Others would argue that the real downfall came basically from World War One because
that's like where it started. Post-Edwardian.
Yeah, because ultimately having an empire that spans 4 continents, maybe even 5 continents. That gets really ultimately expensive, and ultimately it was just it was just an absolute nightmare financially speaking to maintain something that large. And then you have, which we as I understand it, basically at the time, barely just to be able to keep going. Financially speaking, I mean, a lot of what the monarchy did, especially prior to the start, especially what the Bank of England did in 1688, thanks to a certain Dutchman called William of Orange. Yeah, that, ironically enough, set the ball running for many economic problems we have with the country. Okay. But then here comes World War One. We effectively sacrificed an entire generation, and then the whole thing naturally just starts to fall apart because we've lost huge amounts of money. We're having to pay money back to America that we borrowed. Lost huge amounts of like an entire generation, and trying to maintain a quote unquote empire that's literally, it's just unobtainable. When you're a tiny onion, you're trying to control territories thousands upon thousands of miles away without modern, with the technology that was around back then, it was a nightmare.
Okay, and do you think that's really, like I said, you're saying lost a generation, basically? I think per capita, World War One had the most casualties out of any war, just at least relative to a modern population or contemporary population. But is that where? And so I don't really know much. Like I just read Douglas Murray's. I just finished it today, actually. Strange Death of Europe. He didn't really touch on this particular aspect, but since lost so much of their population, young men in the war, is there a link between that and spike in immigration, particularly from well, of course, it started with the territories and colonies, but is there a link between that, would you say?
There's definitely a link, but ultimately, one thing I do hypothesize regarding history, now I'm pretty unique from what I've spoken to people about this, is that I would argue World War II could have been completely avoided if maybe the English were a bit more aggressive in the aftermath of World War I.
Okay.
Now, I know people perhaps study this for years, you'll think, what on earth am I talking about? But with what I understand, with the Treaty of Versailles, the sheer amount of debt which led to the Weimar Republic, the explosion of the real big explosion of Marxist political ideology during World War I into the 1920s, which gave rise to the ASGWP, to get around YouTube's guidelines, along with the Great Depression in the United States, with the Federal Reserve, and all those events, all those things came on top, which ultimately led to World War II. And effectively, the idea of us trying to hold an empire when we have a growing power in Germany, France having their own issues, and also America, obviously being now the biggest player technically, because America at the time, well, it still is now, but back then, America was the richest nation in the world.
Britain by the end of World War, by the end of World War II, controlled the United States controlled like over 1/3 of the world's GDP.
Exactly, and that is a huge power grab. And I know that sounds ridiculous to today's anyone thinking of this in the context of 2021. But to give you perspective, imagine in a sense being as rich as Scrooge McDuck from DuckTales compared to someone like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates.
Okay, yeah, that is. I mean, I don't know what Scrooge McDuck's net worth is, but I mean, I can.
It's been. He's
estimated. Like old money. He's old money.
It's estimated based on theorists out there. They reckon he had, I think, around over half of the world's wealth. I think he had something like a worth of something like $33 trillion.
Okay.
Like an outrageously stupid amount of money. Yeah, something like that, based on how much gold he had. But ultimately, but that's fantasy, of course.
Yeah.
But so you have such a big player like that, and then you have Britain next through the empire. And then I think third, if memory serves, was either France. I can't remember if it was. I'm not sure if it was Germany because it bankrupt. Maybe it might have been France, or it could have been Russia at the time. I'm not sure. I'll have to double check that. But effectively, Germany, after the issues what we had during the 1920s, come the 1930s with the rise of the party I referenced.
Yeah,
they end up growing and heavily industrializing, as well as cooking the books. But they end up effectively pushing their own policies, and they vastly strengthen their entire nation. Now, one subject that no one likes to talk about, part of the reason they had such a competitive edge over us when it came to wartime was through motor racing.
Okay.
Because throughout the early 30s,
that began in like within the first decade, I think, of the.
No, but specifically the 1930s,
okay.
Where the German manufacturers, Mercedes and Auto Union, what we now know as Audi.
Yeah, Audi.
They dominated the early days of Grand Prix racing before what we know as Formula One. The 1930s, they utterly dominate in terms of engineering excellence compared to what the French were doing, the British were doing, and so on and so forth. So they had a major competitive edge compared to us, where they were basically growing and strengthening themselves in terms of their economy, industrially speaking. We were effectively, in a sense, putting ourselves in austerity to try and pay back our debt and utterly screwing ourselves over economically speaking.
So I'd say that in a sense, the automobile racing, that would be an example of like sort of at the end of like every empire, you have like the bread and circuses stage. That kind of corresponds to that, I guess, in a sense.
In a sense, but also you think back, especially, and this is something I will say economically and politically speaking, that when you have a very aggressive, strong leader, things do get done. Now, this isn't an endorsement, technically speaking, of so-called dictatorships, but you cannot deny the results when it comes to growing a nation, if done correctly.
And that was why even FDR admired Mussolini in like the 20s and 30s.
Well, exactly. I mean, there's the joke that Mussolini made the trains run on time. No. I mean, I'm not sure how the trains are now in Italy, for instance, but like when I went to Dortmund in Germany, I thought, okay, German trains, they must be pretty well good. No, half of them were late.
Really, Germany of all places, like they invented the clock and punctuality.
Well, I mean, but yeah, I was shocked. I was like, oh my lord, it's like I never left England when it came to how bad trains were running on time.
Because I mean, I've had people tell me that, and I was kind of surprised that before Thatcher, the trains ran on time back when the railroads were nationalized. I mean, I don't know how accurate that is, but that's what I've been told.
Well, here's the thing. There is an old joke regarding British Rail, which, believe it or not, it's funny you mentioned British Knight earlier. I'm pretty certain is doing a video tomorrow on that. Okay. So he'll get more into details. But as I understand it, funny Ginger. What's it called? Yeah, so there's the old joke that British Rail, basically, there was the old saying that, I see you posted up there, the old saying of "we're getting there," which was known that they were notorious for being late. Yeah. And ultimately, I wasn't around. I was too young to talk about this, but people who I speak to who are in their 50s and 60s who dealt with it constantly have negative things to say about it, like the state of the trains, the cost of them, how they were horrendously late, so on and so forth. And everyone now complains about the train network today after Thatcher privatized a lot. But the problem is with the current train network is that it's based on regional monopolies. So if I wanted to get a train to where I live to, let's say Cornwall in the southwest, I can only go on Great Western. If I want to go to London, I have to use Chiltern, and so on and so forth. So you have all these regional monopolies, and the best example I could think of would be, let's say, the regional, I know this was a case years ago, the regional monopolies of cable networks.
Okay.
In America.
What do you think the net worth of the Fat Conductor is?
If that's the Thomas the Tank Engine.
Oh yeah, no, the Railroadster, yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm somewhat knowledgeable. I mean, I was more into trains as a kid than I am today, but a lot of the issues with the modern railway network today, it's ironically enough a problem that goes back to the Industrial Revolution, because all of our old lines are based on light trains, are like light good trains, and they're not suitable for high speed sort of multi-carriage sort of fast trains. Not necessarily bullet trains, but like pretty fast trains going like above 100 miles an hour. So ironically,
like the diesel ones, I'm guessing.
Kinda, yeah. But like, let's say the main coach lines from, let's say, like between the big cities. I did not know that, Ginger.
That makes sense. I mean, I was actually just kind of thinking, is it based on like one of those islands out there?
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, but like I said, that's an old series, and all the trains in question. I know. What's his name? Academic Nature did a big stream.
No, I was about to say,
trains. Yeah.
He did. He just had it. It was his 2-part stream on the history of the British Railway. Yeah, those are good. Yeah, good one.
Yeah, and it just shows that the ironic weakness of being the first to something is that you have to deal with all the problems for being first. You know, even like for instance, stuff with like a sewage system. We still have loads of problems with our sewage system because of the fact we were the first to have a proper sewage, quote unquote, modern sewage system with the Industrial Revolution. Same thing with, let's say, telecommunications. Whereas if you look at, let's say, even nations like Romania, a former communist nation, they have on average higher internet speeds compared to Britain because of the fact they got into all that stuff much later compared to when we did it.
Okay.
So I know that sounds weird to some listening, but sometimes it's not always best to be the first to something.
So that said, I'm just briefly talking about that. So we come to so the end of the British Empire. We had Churchill's first government, the Conservative government. I think until 45, before Attlee. So would you say, in a sense, because I know you're not really a fan of Winston Churchill, but would you say almost his prime ministership, at least his second ministership, I don't know if that's the correct terminology, but in the 50s, because I know like his whole MO at first was like wartime leader, but then his second government, which was 1950, 1951, started around there. Do you think almost that was sort of like almost like the last ditch attempt to save the British Empire, kind of like a cope in a sense?
Well, when it comes to the reason, like I give Churchill credit for winning the war, even though on 2 occasions he almost cost us the war for not being careful what he was doing. More specifically, when he was doing telephone calls to FDR at the time, the Nazis were listening in on his line, which he thought was secure, but ultimately wasn't. And, if he didn't realize this sooner enough, like if he didn't realize this at the time, we could have easily lost that war, because ultimately the war of communications was incredibly vital. So obviously I give him credit where it's due for helping us win the war with his bullishness. But when it comes to very true, Ginger, when it comes to his second term, almost nobody talks about it, and most people aren't even aware he even had a second term.
Mm-hmm. That must tell you people think that his second term was consecutive.
Yeah, which ultimately it wasn't, because after 1945, Labour got in after 10 years out of office with Attlee, and that's when he came to office and started to push things such as the National Health Service and so on and so forth.
Churchill later supported, I know, even though he was basically on economics, free market for the most part. Yeah. Churchill. Speaking of Churchill, not old Labour.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, on the NHS itself, like I can understand why it was put in at the time, because post-war, healthcare was basically, from what I understand, completely privatized in a sense. Was basically like complete private, and the idea of NHS sort of made sense after a war because of the amount of injuries and illnesses going around. So it made somewhat sense to centralize it all. The problem with the holy grail in this country called the NHS is that it hasn't updated or evolved as times moved on.
Mm-hmm. And then you had some similar things here in the U.S. too, with a lot of the social programs that FDR created. And I know this was during the war, and some of them was an attempt to get out of the Depression. However, of course, it's a myth that the New Deal got us out of the Depression. It just gave people hope, really. What got us out of the Depression was, again, it was
the war.
Sort of, the war economy, and then even more some of the free market reforms under Truman. But for the most part, the initial stimulus was the war economy. But he created things like Social Security. And the funny thing is, like, the original advertisements, I don't think that's the best word to use, but I guess pamphlets, promotional material for Social Security. It was like, there is no guarantee that you will ever receive this money again, which is not many people remember. But like, those were meant to be temporary programs. But I forget who said it. It may have been Milton Friedman, and I think Reagan. It's attributed to Reagan, but I think it was Friedman who said it at first. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program.
The temporary government solution, I've heard.
Something like that.
I've heard that attributed to Freeman. But it's funny you mentioned Freeman, because I remember he was speaking with a couple of other people. I believe they were economists or might have been political commentators at the time, where he spoke about Social Security. And what's ironic about Social Security at the time when it came into America, are you aware by any chance why the age was set to 65?
Well, that was because the death, like the average life expectancy was lower. It was like 63 or something. Or lower than that, maybe. I don't know.
You are correct. It was originally 64 years old, the average life expectancy.
Mm-hmm. Which is why, I mean, basically, so Social Security is going to be bankrupt in the United States within 10, 12 years. I'm never gonna see that money again that I pay, which is BS. But the thing is, these people, if the Democrats especially, if they want to save Social Security, I have no idea why they don't want to raise the retirement age, because that makes the most sense. I just feel like they don't get it, or some sort of ideological commitment or something like that.
Well, I mean, the thing is, though, it was originally brought in almost like a late life lottery in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, right? So if you reach the age of 65, boom, you get basically, quote unquote, government checks to, quote unquote, take care of you. Now, considering that there was such a huge population paying into it, and there was a tiny amount of population taken out of it, obviously the pot of gold at the time when it was first put in, just grew in size. Now, ultimately, when the boomer generation came about post-World War II, with the advancements of medicine and science and surgery techniques and so on and so forth, obviously that natural life expectancy started to grow to where we are now, which is between 79 to 81 for most countries, with a few exceptions. Like, I believe Japan's up to 85 because it's Japan. But with that, obviously, when you get to the boomer generation, they have all this huge amount of pot, and they're getting very generous social security checks. But because the age of retirement to gain social security didn't evolve as the time, the pot's just naturally going to shrink and shrink and shrink. And that's why governments have been forced to try and maintain a social security system, is reducing the amount of payments out. Now, ultimately, if you're coming after the boomer generation to, let's say, late Gen X, you're going to be really annoyed at that the generation before you got such a great deal, whereas you're getting a raw deal, which was, I believe, Milton Friedman actually correctly predicted when they spoke about this back on the subject in question. Now, when it comes to our generation, millennials and even Gen Zs, I highly doubt we're going to even get a social security system. We're going to have to rely on private pensions from our jobs.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, not just that. I mean, if you technically think about it, those boomers who gained the massive pensions, it's technically not their tax. It's not technically their taxes. It's technically everyone else's taxes that they're living off. The ones that they paid for were for the previous generation.
We're the ones who are subsidizing the elderly. Yeah.
Exactly. And I know there is, and I have, funny you mentioned this subject, I have heard of this cycle, which used to be a common trend in generations, was that where it was the child, adult, elderly free tier stage, as in the elderly mentored the adult paid for the elderly, while the adult produced and raised the children, and then the cycle just kept going on and on and on. So as an adult, as a child, you pay your dues to listen to your elders. You work to have a family to pay for your parents when they're old, while producing children, and the cycle continues. Now, this was a common trend many, many years ago. That's why it was common for, let's say, people in farmhouses or even people in the early Industrial Revolution to have lots and lots of kids, because it was a way to maximize your income. Mm-hmm. Obviously, but with the change of labor laws, a lot of people who had loads of kids were thrown away.
So what would you say, at least on...
Sure, my mistake. Yeah, sorry. So I made, yes, what Ginger said in chat, yeah, I did mean that in the sense where the adults would work and bring the income, and the elderly help raise the children and bring wisdom to them.
Yeah, that's always kind of like what it's been. But it seems like that kind of changed with it seems like the boomers kind of tried, but then they were also kind of in a sense distant to their, I mean, let's see, boomers, kids, so younger Gen X and older, younger Gen X and then older millennials. That would have been the children of the boomers. But but either way, what was interesting is, so you had the what was it, the greatest generation before no.
I think it was greatest, silent
generation, yeah. So greatest, silent, and then something like that. But either way, so you had the silent generation, who was who were the more, and the greatest too, who were the more kind of, I guess, conservative in the cultural and the social sense, who tried to sort of instill these, like, basically, if you think of, like, if you've read Nietzsche, there's that sort of dichotomy between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and it will always swing hard towards one side and then swing, like, sort of more of a puritanical, moral, practically minded society, and then it'll go towards, like, a very sort of, I don't want to say degenerate, because that's not necessarily the case, but a very more sort of artistic, I guess, libertine and sort of like laid back society. And what's interesting is you see that with, you start with the sort of again, the practically minded silent generation, Apollonian, again, best adjective. And then with the boomers, you see the boomer revolt in the 1960s. With the, like, Summer of Love, Free Love, Austin Powers, basically, which that movie series completely makes fun. Basically, that movie series is makes fun of 1960s culture.
Well, also it's ultimately a parody of James Bond. But if you think of like the time of like the 60s, well, especially post-war II in America, especially in the 60s, it was honestly a great time to live in because the economy, you're doing absolutely tremendously. You have, the space race, you're trying to go for the stars, all that stuff, all the manufacturing jobs out there, such good pay. You could work in a factory and have a lovely suburban house, wife,
class,
kids.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
lower middle class could afford a single family house with a yard, whereas probably our generation, the only homeowners, or not the only ones, but like probably 2/3 of them are just going to be those who inherit their houses from the parents.
Exactly. And one thing I will say: inheritance tax is blatant theft. I will definitely agree with 100%. The most libertarian / ANCAPs on that subject of taxes theft. That aspect of tax is blatant theft. But I digress. But especially in that time period, it was such a great time to be, especially in America. Like, I mean, especially when I think of the prime example, Detroit, Motown, Motor City. Like Detroit itself, if I remember correctly, in 1960, it was either 1960 or 1965, one of the two. It was the richest city in the world.
Detroit, really? I did not know that.
What do you think? You had Motown.
Manufacturing, yeah.
Or that you pretty much almost built every single American car you could think of, from Ford, Chevrolet, Dodge, Buick, General Motors, Lincoln, Oldsmobile. They put them all built in Detroit. And you were building them at outrageous levels.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was literally, it was very rare you see a non-American car on the streets back in that era. Like you might see a Jag, you might see a Mercedes, you might see something Japanese, but it was extremely rare. It was basically, oh, there's a Ford there, there's a Chevy there, so on and so forth. It was such a great time, especially economically speaking. People grew up that generation.
Yeah, exactly. And then, I mean, at the same time, the 60s were a giant double-edged sword, because that's sort of when the social fabric started coming apart. And then you also had the Vietnam War, which I think was total failure. But then at the same time, and then you had like everyone was getting assassinated. That was like the decade of assassinations. But then you also have it at the same, very similar to the 1860s, which was simultaneously a good decade and a bad decade, because you had like the Civil War and you had slavery, and then also at the same time one of the biggest industrial booms in not just U.S. history but also Western history in general, and even East Asia too, the spread of industry. But so 1960, then that's when all the good music started coming into after a decade of like really.
I know we shouldn't be. I know I'm talking a lot about the United States, but in terms of the UK's context, post like World War II, where we had the NHS, we went into massive amounts of austerity. I mean, people talk about austerity in the last 10 years. No, this sort of austerity we're talking about post World War II. I believe our debt to GDP ratio at the time.
Under Powell?
No. This was like from Attlee's afterwards. So just after the war. If memory serves, the GDP to debt ratio was around 250%. In that time period, which was utterly ridiculous, because that's how much debt we got strangled in, partly because of borrowing money from you, but having to pay that back. And also, I would argue we should have got money from World War II, but we ultimately forgave it because we didn't want to repeat the mistakes of World War with the Versailles Treaty. Mm-hmm. And we were basically strangling ourselves and the government at the time was nationalizing everything it could get its hands on, various automotive, especially the railway networks and so on and so forth. And I know at the time as well, America, you were also, and one thing I wish the government did at the time was, instead of America investing loads of money into what we knew at the time as West Germany, was pumping money into us to help regrow our nation, because ultimately we were allied nations. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, clearly, the US government had other ideas. So, and then we have that era. We get past the 1950s where we're trying to grow, and we did have what we called like credible, respectable institutions, especially in terms of education and so forth. But then post the 60s, we had obviously a similar hippie thing to you. We had like the Beatles, which were a huge international success. Obviously, we're starting to build our own film brands such as Bond, so forth. We also had loads of comedy and also stuff with the BBC.
60s, 70s golden age of film too.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. I mean, especially in America, but we had our stuff in the UK, but and television was good in that era. You know, they had great comedies in that era. 1670s were great for comedy, but
and
ultimately,
science fiction too, I'd say.
Oh yeah, definitely as
Doctor
well
Who,
with Doctor
classic.
Who. Yeah, I mean, I only watched a bit of it when it came to the reboot in the in the 2000s. Oh, I never watched the originals, but you get to that era, and then ultimately come the 70s. That's when everything started to really go downhill because of because that's when we eventually joined the European Economic Community, as it was known as, in 1972. Now, that had huge controversy, politically speaking, because now I'm not one who has huge understandings of law and history, but from what I understand, listening to a lady called Helen Dale, I'm not sure if you've heard of her.
No, I have not.
Well, she was interviewed by a few people, such as Sargon and a couple of others. And from what she understood, it was technically unconstitutional to take us into the European Union. Well, the EEC, which we now know as the European Union.
Proto-EU, yeah.
Yeah. Now, the main argument for us joining was about free trade and opening markets and to trying to be more friendly with our neighbors, quote unquote. Yeah. That's how it was sold. But the 70s were in a horrendous time in the UK, economically speaking, because we had, all the huge amounts of strikes in the automotive and mining sectors, for energy. Hence, we had things like the 3-day week, double-digit inflation, constant blackouts, trash not being picked up, all this stuff, where it was very feisty switching between Labour, Tory, Labour, Tory, Labour, Tory. But then ultimately come to the end of the 70s, which is where Thatcher came in. And this is where she did the whole this is where she really imposed neoliberalism, economically speaking. Yeah. Or some people like to call it Reaganomics. Mm-hmm. And
you're not a fan of Thatcher, from what I remember, correct?
Oh, I am. You won't find many people on the right who utterly detest Thatcher as much as someone from the left. And I know
I know the left. Thatcher's government was simultaneously the most popular and least popular in British history by that time.
Well, part of the reason she got in, and the thing was, she basically took a lot of ideas and talking points from her quote unquote favorite parliamentarian, who shall not be named because if you say his name, the YouTube bots ears perk up and want to investigate us. So I'm not going to say his name. Okay. Yeah, but everyone knows exactly who I mean by this. His initials is EP. Sorry.
Ah, yes, I meant, yeah, okay.
Yes, I had a sudden cough there, sorry. And with that being said, she ended up taking these ideas but royally butchering them, especially economically speaking. And she ultimately promoted the mass selling of the automotive industry.
Let's call them Ernie Poggers, maybe.
Yeah, you could say that. So she does the mass selling off of the automotive industry, specifically British Leyland, which at the time made sense to put all UK manufacturers under one roof. The issue was the sheer amount of infighting, and also being run by the government doesn't help, especially when you have people who don't know anything about how a car works running a company. Would you let someone run a hospital if they never had any understanding of the medical industry?
Well, of course not.
Absolutely. So with that was sold off. The rail industry was all sold off, and she was basically a massive sellout to the country. And she ended up pushing the shift from manufacturing to the service industry.
Okay.
Yes, Ginger. Ernie Pandas. That's the code word.
I still like Ernie Poggers, but Ernie Panders, whatever. Yeah.
As I was saying, so she was just selling out, and then she shifted much more to the service industry, specifically banking, and that's where the quote unquote economic zone of the City of London was partially created because of that, and that's when a lot of the economy itself just became completely centralized around London.
Mm-hmm. And I know in the 1800s, it was the economic capital of the world. And then in the 70s and 80s, it was kind of going back and forth between London and New York City.
because there was a huge amount of competing because of New York, with it being New York, because part of the reason why New York got a lot of hostility was because there was huge issues with, let's say, the crime and the mafia.
Yeah, exactly. It was like basically 80s, in the 80s, it was basically coming out of its like Taxi Driver, Joker era. If you've seen those movies, basically. 70s New York. That
it was not a good time to be a New Yorker back then. But so on and so forth. But then, and also, especially during the time throughout the, especially post-World War II, we had the Windrush generation where we imported lots of labor from the Caribbean and South Asia to fill up labor and so on and so forth. And then that's when a lot of the push for multiculturalism, as it was called back then. But
wasn't it generally from, and when I say the right here, or maybe I should just say center right, wasn't a lot of it from a lot of the neoliberals in Thatcher's government? Because I know a lot of people in old labor were against the idea, because I mean, it goes back to the whole concept. You can't have a welfare state and immigration, or at least mass immigration at the same time. And he even had people, what's interesting, if you take a look at him back then, as opposed to him right now, Kinnock, for example, was, I believe, more skeptical towards immigration in the late 70s. And now he takes basically, once after Blair, all labor just took the pro-immigrant or pro-mass immigration position.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly with Kinnock, but because I know he was at the time, especially going off when I know from the 88 election, largely thanks to Joe Biden, your current prime minister.
He ripped off of Kinnock's speeches.
Yeah, completely ripped them off, one to one.
I know Kinnock recently made a joke. I'd be more than happy to be Biden's speechwriter.
Yeah, well, you're perhaps right. Well, he'll definitely make Joe Biden 100% more competent in terms of talking. But I digress. But so obviously you have these always massive shifts coming about. And that's why there was this giant, like, national sort of rejection of it when the certain man did his speech. But what was ironic is, and you'll never see this in political you'll never see this in modern politics. You had the core of two voting blocs standing side by side, marching side by side, demanding him to be reinstated after he was sacked.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I don't know of an example in American politics where that has happened. But that's the only time it's ever happened in British politics. And to quote a certain absolute asshole, Michael Heseltine, who was a conservative, who was a member of the Conservative Party at the time, who doesn't live too far from where I lived. He straight up said, if there was an American-style election tomorrow, he would have won. The man in question by a landslide. Purely because of the response. And that's what got him reinstated, and ironic enough, which gave Edward Heath, the man who he competed for leadership at the time, he's the main reason he got him in 1970.
Okay.
Which a lot of everyone seems to forget. And he's also the reason why he took him out in 1974, because the opposition, Howard Wilson, who was the prime minister before Edward Heath, was offering a referendum on the European question, because Enoch initially was in favor of joining based on the idea of open trade and free markets, but he ended up turning against it because of the political and economic, because of the true nature of it. So he was standing side by side with a big name in labor circles at the time, Tony Benn, and them two were the main advocates against with the Leave side at the time in 1975.
And then weren't labor, at least back in, because I know basically, the Liberal Party was still a thing until 89 when the Lib Dems were created. You basically had the Social Democrat guy, and then there was, I forget what the joke back then was, that the leader of the Liberal Party was like really weak-willed and was basically just a puppet of the head of the Social Democrats. Like that was kind of like I remember seeing political cartoon, but you had the Liberal Party, I know, back in the early 1900s, and it really it collapsed after the more free market, the tradition of like Bentham, Mill, those guys ended up joining the Conservative Party, and Churchill being one of them. But then you had the So it was basically Conservative Party versus Labor, and I think Labor was founded like after World War I. But I know also you had the because the Conservatives were classically, in the classical sense, they were the quote unquote liberals. They, I think at the time, were more open to immigration than the Labor Party back then, because very similar to here in the United States, which was like the hardcore unionists, the populists. Like you had, let me think of a good name, Labor members like Oddball Mosby.
Oh yes. Well, on him himself. Recently, I have come across some of his speeches at the time, and he did hit the nail on the head when it came to the economic sense of what the monarchy about regarding to the British Empire, and so on and so forth.
He was pretty anti-imperialist at one point, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was very much anti-imperialist. Now, ultimately, his name is got lots of it's been heavily tainted, purely due to the fact that obviously he got married in a certain propagandist house with a certain leader as guest of honor.
Yes, a certain leader from Central Germany.
Yes.
Central Europe.
Central Europe. Yeah, with Central Europe. Yes. So, but also for me, when it comes to him, I personally have more of an issue with his son than necessarily with him himself. But
interesting.
But that's due to how much he tried to deliberately undermine and mess with an industry I take hold very dearly. But we'll get to that later.
I always had this joke where Oddball Mosby, basically, it was Jeremy Corbyn is basically an anti-Semitic version of Oddball Mosby.
Well, I mean, they're very different in terms of many aspects.
Yeah, I don't know.
Because when it comes to JC, he seems to quite often just be the opposition for the sake of opposition, and he's
supported Brexit not because he ideologically supported it, but because he I don't want to say he hates Britain, because that's a straw man, but he does not want a particularly strong Britain. So he supported it for more demagogue reasons as opposed to
what's really ironic is, obviously during the time of Thatcher, obviously when he was in the party, especially in his early years, especially during the times of Thatcher, he was against it purely because of the fact that Thatcher and co were in favor of it. But then when it came to the 2016 referendum, he voted in favor of it.
That was because the establishment Tories, I think the Theresa May people were
here's the thing, and this is what annoys me with everyone who hasn't been paying attention when it comes to the subject of Brexit. Almost nobody in the Tory party wanted Leave to win. Almost nobody in the Tory party wanted it. Maybe one or two potentially, like someone like Dan Hanlon, who's obviously a member of the European Parliament for the Tories. But ultimately, the party itself has been, historically speaking, the most pro-European Union party.
Exactly, the free trade aspect, I believe.
Yeah, quote unquote free trade.
Quote unquote free,
yeah. Now, this is what annoyed me with people when it came to that election. Well, especially after the referendum. Why on earth would you trust the party that took you into it to take you out of it?
Interesting.
I mean, I hate to use this extreme example, but it's like allowing a certain Austrian painter to be leader of Israel. Would you trust him to? Would you trust him to?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. To give you a British example, it's like
I know I've heard people from Hamas, or I should say hummus, using a food.
Hummus. Yes, of course, lovely hummus.
Hummus, a lovely organization in Palestine, but hummus. I've seen, for some reason the tweets weren't taken down, but I've seen tweets them basically they sort of did it in an interesting way, not an I stand this guy, but basically saying, you know what, this German-speaking painter. It has like I think you basically know where I'm going with this. Yeah. Again, I don't want to say anything that could be taken out of context or anything because but you know what I mean, like basically saying things that seem sort of secondhand in support of his views on
absolutely but this is the funny thing is that but this is the ironic thing is that why would you trust these people who took you into it to take you out of it? And ultimately with the whole negotiation aspect, where the whole negotiation aspect and the election and the two elections, the political discord and the media and activists, it was an absolute utter feces show, to put it politely.
Mm-hmm.
And me, when I saw the referendum come out, I looked at it and I support my vote. Even though I don't support UK being in the European Union or even the organization itself, I didn't vote to leave. And unlike certain YouTubers much bigger than us, they did actually, ironically enough, vote Remain, even though they weren't in favor of it. AA, I'm looking at you. So yes, so
he voted Remain, which I was surprised to.
And if memory serves, he did it because he was worried about the value of the house.
Okay, that's so more of a pragmatic, less ideological. But then I feel like part of it could have been because he was more of a libertarian back then, so it could have been again for the quote unquote free trade aspect too, maybe.
Yeah. So on that point, though, so obviously it's a complete joke, the whole negotiation. And it made me laugh was the way they went about so-called leaving it when, from what I was reading, if the Tories were so serious about leaving the European Union, they didn't have to hold a referendum or trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. All they had to do, shocking, Ginger, shocking. I'm gonna have to give him a cross internet slap for that one. But yes, so as for the vote, where I saw it was either leave will not be respected or it's the status quo. Because if Remain won, I knew full well the Leave people like Farage would be told to shut up and we'll just carry on as normal. If Leave won, it was going to be a massive feces show. There's going to be tons of accusations of cheating, all the usual malarkey, and they're not really gonna honor it. And ironically enough, I was proven correct with the state of where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to the whole leaving aspect, the way they went around it was the worst case to leave, because if they were serious about certain people saying they wanted the so-called no-deal Brexit, what he had to do, the Tories, was find the 1972 European Communities Act, which references the 1972 Treaty of Accession, which was the treaty that we signed to join the EEC at the time. What he had to do was revoke it. Like that, and then we're out.
So where do you think everything, so we're going to move on to, again, more contemporary stuff here in a moment, because we're reaching the hour. I don't want to go for more than 2. But so where do you think sort of just in general, so we have the modern state of UK politics and culture. What do you think the, if you were to pick any decade or even any year, it doesn't matter, I'll give you some flexibility with that. When would you say things started going downhill? Culturally and politically. Because I know you have, I know the 80s was a bit chaotic, but economically and politically, it was generally, I know there were a lot of people who hated Thatcher, but Thatcher was generally viewed by the world as a strong leader, even though she sort of had that imperialist cope, like basically trying to with the Falklands and everything. But you have Thatcher, who was generally a strong leader in the 80s, objectively speaking. But then after that, it seems like maybe sometime around the rise of, and I don't hate New Labour. I actually think compared to New Labour or the Corbynista types and post Corbynista Labour, generally New Labour, the Blairites, at least on economics, were a much better alternative. Because I know there was actually they mentioned that there was, I think it was in classic Spitting Image, it was, they were like, okay, what is the difference between the conservatives and Labour? What really makes Labour stand out? What is our agenda? And then one of them said, something about being similar to conservatives, or do we join the Tories? And then they said no, and it's like, oh no, let's just adopt their policies.
Yeah, I mean, this is
why their strategy meeting, and there's like a picture of Marx in the background. And
yeah. I mean, me personally, I jokingly say that the Tories are just diet Labour. Like, okay. I mean, for me, like, why would you bother buying a Diet Coke when you could just have proper Coke?
Yeah,
and no,
or at least Diet New Labour, maybe. Because people would also say, I know the left. I mean, you had like the old Labour, and then the more newer socialist types who always said that New Labour is just diet. They're just the diet Tories. So that's interesting that you said the opposite.
Well, yeah, because people say that Tony Blair copied from Thatcher, and like the thing is, though, what Tony Blair pushed for, he ironically enough pushed many I mean, sure, he somewhat continued on the trend of Thatcher economically speaking, in a sense, not 100%, in a sense. A few differences he had with Thatcher was he was far more agreeable with the European Union. He gave vastly more money to the European Union compared to Thatcher, which one thing I could at least give a bit of credit to Thatcher for was taking back some of the funds we were paying into it, because when I believe it was before the negotiation on the rebate, we were the highest net contributor to the European Union at the time, or EEC as it was known, prior to 1993.
Prior to the reunification of Germany.
Yeah. So, and what happened was Tony Blair gets in, he pays even higher sums to it, net. And also he signs off on the Nice Treaty in 2001. He even for a time period had a seat on the European Commission in 2005, which you would know if you've seen the video of Nigel Farage scolding him in the European Parliament. I think it was for 6 months. I think it was like a very short period of time while he was our Prime Minister.
Okay. And, basically, I've always seen Blair as, I know he was like a more socially, quote unquote, liberal. I mean, Academic Age, or Peter Hitchens actually wrote an interesting book. I actually haven't read it, but I mean, I've seen a summary where he actually argues that Blair was like a cultural revolutionary. I mean, I still need to read the book to see if I agree with him, but apparently, according to AA, he makes a good argument. Apparently, according to him, it's like a quote unquote red pill book. But either way, so Blair, though, I've always seen as just slightly more culturally liberal George W. Bush, because he did come. I mean, basically, he was basically a neoconservative in a lot of regards. Not socially, definitely. Of course, but in terms of his economics and in terms of his foreign policy.
Yeah, especially foreign policy. I mean,
more of an imperialist than Thatcher.
I want to use the word imperialist. I want to say use the word imperialist.
Internationalist, maybe?
He's definitely an internationalist, that's for sure. And ironically enough, he ended up pushing many sleight-of-hand Marxist policies through the door as well, because he did expand the welfare state. He ultimately supercharged the multiculturalism mass migration experiment, along with and also pushing the whole aspect of education to try and send as many as half of children at the time to university.
But was that based? Oh, continue. Sorry.
Yes, because he was trying to copy certain countries in Europe, whereas the reason why there was such a low amount of kids going to the universities was because back then they had very, very high standards to try and get in. Whereas when Labour came in, they completely tweaked they changed many aspects of the education curriculum. And I was educated during the Blair era. And I finished just after I finished all my studies. Well, I finished my school studies, quote unquote, in 2009. So basically, just before the end of New Labour. and the quality was significantly reduced as well. And also, they lowered the standards at all for entering universities, as well as pushing a lot of the debt. They kickstarted the debt, copying America in a sense. One of the worst exports of America, dare I say one of many, with the debt aspect of further education.
So with the socialist takeover of labor, and I know the Lib Dems began in 89, 90, somewhere around there. But with the sort of the collapse of New Labor and sort of the hard left taking over the party after Blair's government, isn't that really when the and I know they didn't become like a super major party in the same sense as the other two, but is that really when a lot of the New Labor people ended up going over to the Lib Dems, and then also eventually you had a lot of the pro EU conservative Tories who went over to the Lib Dems as well? Is that kind of when their growth began?
Well, when it comes to so-called certain Blairites, and I use Blairites very loosely, and so-called EU Tories, certain EU Tories, I believe what you're mistaking from the Lib Dems is referring to the new party known as Change UK, or CUC as it was nicknamed, which was founded by the likes of...
That's hilarious. That's actually what it was called?
Yeah, Change UK, or anagrams CUK.
Okay, they did that to themselves. I'm sorry.
Yeah, they did. And that made me laugh as well, because they didn't want anything to change. They just wanted the same crap regurgitated, but with a spin of green and XR style environmentalism.
So basically, our democratic establishment here in the U.S.
Well, let's say a pure toxic fusion of, let's say, Hillary Clinton and AOC.
Oh God.
Yeah, that kind of.
and I have way more respect for AOC than I do for Hillary Clinton, because I don't like AOC's policies at all, but I think she's useful in the sense where she just does a lot of damage, and I think she trolls the democratic establishment, which is fun, which is amusing. Like she can occasionally be a Chad.
Well, I won't say she's a Chad. This is exactly why you don't allow children into politics, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I know me and AOC are about the same age. I think she might be a year older.
I think she's
but this is exactly why.
Maybe.
Something like that. I thought she was like 29, 30. Either way, this is why you don't allow kids into politics. And this is why I'm very much against any ideas of dropping the voting age to 16.
Oh, yeah. That's just going to...
I would dare argue you should raise the voting age to around 25. I know that sounds utterly ridiculous, but my lord, like, it's so easy to get young naive kids to vote for you. I mean, hell, if I wanted, and I'm saying this like from 20 years ago, right? If I was running the country and I had all children can vote, if I wanted to get all the kids to vote for me, I'd say to them, you vote for me, I will guarantee you a 120 hit point Charizard Pokemon card delivered to your door.
Oh yeah,
all the kids are going to vote for me straight away.
And then you could also have like parents influencing their kids too, saying, "Hey, I will buy you this new video game if you go vote for my candidate."
Well, exactly, and like
you voters too.
Exactly, because the naive people, you just give them something that they may want, or maybe something they never thought about that they do want. I know this from like when I worked in retail. There's this concept in the world of marketing called I forget the exact term, but effectively you give a consumer a product or service that they did not realize that they wanted, but they must have.
Yeah,
I forget what it's called, but
building a basket, is that what they called it? I was in retail too, so
might be that, but effectively like
upselling.
Yeah, it could be upselling as a term, yes, but let's say I don't know.
But basically, if they're looking if you're looking for a Bible, let's say you work at a bookstore, if you're buying a Bible, say, "Hey, have you ever read Confessions by St. Augustine?" Yeah, it's a good companion. Yeah,
exactly. There's one example like that. Yeah, so you have this. So obviously, that's what the CUK party was, and that flopped hard. massively hard, and a couple of them shifted to like the Lib Dems. I know one of the main ones was Chuka Imunda, who regard themselves as the British Obama, which was laughable because he's a tit, complete tit. And I mean, as much as I don't like Barack Obama, Barack Obama was at least charismatic.
He was a great figurehead. Like, I mean, his policies did not. I liked his policy on trade. That was about it. But other than that, I think let's say in the United States, if the head of state and head of government were two completely different offices, I think Obama would have been a fantastic, made a fantastic head of state. I don't think he was a good policymaker, but I think he was a fantastic figurehead.
Well, Barack himself, he would have been ideal if you wanted a face for a party, or he was perfect for, let's say, image. He was perfect for image for the Democrats, but you didn't want him being the engine.
Precisely.
Yeah. So, you may have a very beautiful car, but that doesn't necessarily mean you want a beautiful engine. Because quite often the most beautiful engines are the most unreliable. Case in point, Alfa Romeo. But I digress. But yeah, so I do think this. If I were to pick a point of where I this is a complete shot in the dark, where I think when it comes to Britain, things start going downhill, and this is going to sound hilarious to you. It was right after when we won the World Cup in 1966.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you care to elaborate on that?
Well, when we won the World Cup in 1966, beating West Germany at the time.
It was Bayern München, I think.
No, it was West Germany. This is a national tournament, not.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, the World Cup, yeah. So we beat them 4-2 in extra time. And the country was absolutely that was perhaps the happiest time in this country, in the country's history. Well, what was Britain? I know the Scots would have been upset about it, of course, in the Welsh, but yes, Ginger, the Flying Scotsman was a beautiful train back in the day.
There's a Thomas the Tank Engine version of that too, going back to that.
Yes, there is. Yes, I'm not surprised at all. But I digress. Yeah, so you think that was a time when we were in absolute uproar and absolute happiness, but then things just started going downhill afterwards. We were shocking in the 1970 World Cup, especially losing 3-2 to West Germany when we were 2-0 ahead. Then we got to, and just things just start going downhill. Like, we didn't qualify for a tournament for multiple years. And then you had all the, it's just, I don't know why. I think that pinpoint, things just started to go downhill. Might be a butterfly effect. Who knows? But that's one thing for me.
So, but why would you put it? I understand why you make that sort of like a symbolic moment. Yeah. But how do you think it spiraled from there? How is that the point of divergence?
Because there is a thing in I have noticed this when I was looking at looking at, let's say, sporting teams over the years, is that if you have a team that's reached the top, especially in its history, quite often as the expression goes, you reach the top of the mountain. They tend to get lost with the view itself, without looking over their shoulder and seeing who's trying to climb the mountain and surpass them.
Okay.
So they get too complacent with how great things are. And as the old saying goes, complacency is the ultimate enemy of empires.
Exactly. And it's basically but then again, it's sort of like a natural part of it. Are you familiar with Sir John Glubb? He wrote that essay, The Fate of Empires.
I've heard of The Fate of Empires, but I haven't read it.
All right. Yeah, I am not to shill, but I mean, this is definitely something that I think you and maybe the audience would be interested in. About 3 months ago, I made like a documentary. It was about 45 minutes. So I don't know if you guys really have the time, but it's about that entire essay and basically about his 6 stages of empire. It was just called John Glubb and the Fate of Empires. So, I mean, if anyone wants a crash course on that, definitely recommend watching that. But basically, his whole thing was average empire. Or when he says empire, he doesn't mean like a state with an emperor. He just means any superpower. Doesn't matter what the internal politics are. But 250 years average lifespan, 6 stages: age of pioneers, the age of conquests, the age of commerce or merchants or something, and then the age of affluence. and the age of intellect, and then the age of decadence. And it's basically the complacency during the age of affluence that ends up sort of leading to the ultimate decadence that sets in.
Yeah, sure. So with that, yes, but this is what I mean, because we reached the top of the mountain, but then we got very complacent and we end up falling behind, especially the rest of the world. I mean, prior to when England won it, Brazil won it back to back, playing lovely, beautiful samba, free-flowing football with the likes of Pele.
Okay.
And ultimately, they won it back again in 1970. But then, I see a lot of trajectory where we started to get too complacent and we started to go backwards. And I would also add on top of that a very reference to a certain. Actually, I won't reference the individual himself, but I would also argue the international politics of the Cold War definitely did not help as well.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's too cliched, I would say, to point the finger at Russia when we were ultimately not looking at when we weren't necessarily doing a good job, especially our elected officials, in terms of maintaining and improving the nation itself.
The one thing that this is the only thing, and I know it was the one thing that the communist bloc, the people in the communist bloc was right on, was the sort of growing decadence in the West. And I mean, I know that was one of Marx's original reasons for wanting to create communism. He wanted to create like a very puritanical, like Marx was basically, I don't know if he was aware of it, but he basically took Calvinist motifs, made it secular, and wanted to establish sort of a atheistic state built upon Calvinist principles. And I mean, you even saw that within the USSR, and they were criticizing as their whole thing was like it was the mass consumerism that was sort of feeding the decadence, not necessarily the cause. Well, they said it was the cause. I don't think it was necessarily the cause. Definitely didn't help. But that's why I think the only like the best critiques of capitalism, I would say, actually come from the right. Believe it or not.
Well, I mean, the issue I have when people criticize capitalism is that, and Marx was definitely the most guilty of this, but others are guilty as well, is that when they try and pull a moral spin on the subject of capitalism, and capitalism itself is an amoral system.
Precisely.
And I have also noticed this when I've looked into certain ideologies when it comes to Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment, is when it comes to German philosophy, it seems to me that they constantly try and push a moral spin or moral application to something that is fundamentally amoral.
You see that in people like Nietzsche and then Spengler and Heidegger, those guys.
Well, even today with Mr. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum.
And I know he's not German, but Zizek too. I know he's Eastern European, but
yeah. Well, I mean specifically German because this was notorious. It's something I learned and noticed in post-Enlightenment when it comes to German thought.
Yeah, I mean that's why I say that. I mean the reason I say Zizek though is because he's a Heideggerian. Like he's inspired by all the German philosophers, so he might as well be. He's in like the German tradition.
Well, yeah, but obviously you think, especially when Germany had a lot of influence in the East, well, Eastern Europe, considering like the Austro-Hungarian empires, they had lots of people in Germany living in like Russia and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of German influence in Russia, like especially like Eastern Europe, which is why like certain German ideologies were very much were allowed to really gain control in those aspects, and really were highly supported and thought of, compared to, let's say, those of the English and the Anglosphere mentality.
And the irony of that is that, and none of them wanted to really, basically, the the liberal, like there were three political traditions that the Enlightenment gave birth to three political traditions.
Yeah.
And I don't mean like necessarily any of them were reactions to. I think they literally inspired the creation of these traditions. You had the liberalism, of course, and when I say liberalism, I mean everything from like shitlib American liberalism to libertarianism to like modern classical conservatism liberalism. To classical liberalism, even to like social democracy in a sense. But then
in a sense,
also, I mean, because that's basically but that's sort of a synthesis, a Hegelian synthesis with socialism. But then you have the socialists who claimed to be the true heirs to the Enlightenment because they took things even further. And then, of course, and a lot of people are going to disagree with this, but then fascism as well, which took the Enlightenment idea of nationalism. And then they were hyper-modernist futurists who wanted to they didn't really want to return to tradition. I don't think they were reactionaries in that sense. But what they wanted to do is they wanted to just take those traditional motifs and apply it to a sort of futurist sense. It was sort of a marriage between romanticism and romanticism, hypermodernism, nationalism, and also sort of corporatism. So sort of a synthesis of socialism and capitalism, and all of these things, with an exception of romanticism, all of these things are Enlightenment principles.
Yeah, I mean, what also another aspect people seem to ignore or forget about the Enlightenment is the reason for the Enlightenment to even happening was, ironically enough, was due to a quote-unquote atheistic style rejection from the English against the Catholic Church.
I'd actually disagree. I mean, I think you're right to an extent. At least that's maybe how they saw themselves.
That's why I said quote unquote.
I honestly, in a lot of ways, I see the Enlightenment as sort of the natural, because like I view civilizations, I see that they go through natural life cycles. So when I say Western civilization, I mean Western civilization in the sense of beginning with in the 8th century with Christendom. But so I think that the Enlightenment, it was the rationalization, the secularization, the naturalization, and the materialization of the Christian feeling of progress and just the upward progression through time towards utopia, in a sense. Yeah, it was the same motifs, but it was just applied to a more. It was detached from religion. Even though a lot of Enlightenment people, those who weren't deists, a lot of them, like Rousseau, who was like extreme Enlightenment, but also kind of a romanticist, which is interesting. He was like Calvinist, like he and Calvin, also both from Geneva. So.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, but that's what I mean, because ultimately, like, people seem to forget the idea of Protestantism came about of rejection from of Catholicism because of how the Catholic Church blatantly lied to quote unquote the peasants about what their holy books actually stated.
Yeah.
So, and that's element of rejection and calling out a very powerful aspect of authority partially came about due to which partly and not purely, but partially inspired the Enlightenment, because it was a question, because the English were more about bringing about what was truthful, what was true, and what was false.
But I'd also say that the English Reformation didn't even really begin until the early 1600s, until the rise of the Puritans and then the Presbyterians in Scotland, because the Church of England, like, it's considered its creation is considered part of the Reformation because it coincides with that. But it was really just a political schism closer to the schism between East and West in the 11th century. So it was really just Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce, and so he jumped on the Reformation bandwagon kind of as an excuse. And he's like, "Okay, I'm going to like copy pasta Catholicism," and I can attest. I can attest to that as an Anglican myself.
That I can understand, because I remember we did a lot on Tudor history back in school. But like that element of basically telling like a giant authority to kind of f off was very much an empowering thing in England, because especially in Britain, because we were always about trying to bring about accountability to our root leaders, even to the monarchy. So, which is honestly something I've noticed, which seems to be very unique, especially in terms of the continent, whereas the rest of the continent seemed to, maybe not necessarily the likes of France, because how much they love to strike and be quite spiteful in nature. But I have noticed that a lot of the people, when it comes to leaders, they're quite happy for them to be massive hypocrites and just be very abuseful in power because they're the rulers.
Okay.
In a sense. Now, maybe I'm being very ignorant, but I seem to have noticed that why, like, the idea of so-called liberalism, why it started with the English, but it wasn't started by anyone else in the continent. And I think part of that I have spoken about with other people with other people. I think part of that was due to the fact that we lived on an island, and we knew how small we truly are to the world. Whereas if you live in the continent, such as Europe, you have this. There seems to be like it's sort of like almost like an unconscious sort of arrogance, where you see land, you feel like much bigger than what you truly are. And I somewhat see this in America as well, in a sense, because you think of how huge America is. But when you live on an island and you know how big the world and nature is around you, you become I notice you tend to have a much more subconscious what's the word? Not humane. Humbled. You have a more subconscious, humbled view of the world, of the individual itself.
I especially, what's interesting, see this in certain areas of so certain North. Actually, in a lot of ways, I see this more in the South, and I almost wonder if it comes from sort of the more French influence, the more French religious influence. So, for instance, like you have like the Baptists in the South, especially, and Pentecostals, and then sort of descendants of the Huguenots. But you see that down there, and so you sort of see that almost sense of moral superiority, and this sort of plays into the whole. Like you see this with the like the evangelical types who are very, which is interesting because I wouldn't even say they're necessarily puritanical, because I'd actually say that they sort of have like a almost epistemologically right-wing superiority, whereas you have like the northeast, which has a sort of sense of superiority that is far more, I guess. I don't know. I'm kind of just like thinking of this off. It's just kind of a shower thought I'm having right now. But then the ones who are more inspired by, because and this really kind of began with maybe the Irish and the Italian Catholic immigrants who went to like Boston and New York, and you sort of see that that northeastern liberal elitism, so to speak. But then you have the descendants of the Puritans, and then sort of in the middle states, and then in the parts of the South, like like Virginia, North Carolina, the more traditional British liberals, sort of from the Anglican tradition, like a lot of the founding fathers were like that. Like I know Jefferson wasn't religious, but he definitely thought in that very traditionally like Anglo-liberal kind of sense. And it almost makes me wonder if a lot of this did start with the immigration from the mainland.
I would not be surprised either. From what I understand, I could joke to saying the founding fathers were the original Brexiteers and they were filthy traitors to the monarchy in question. But I digress. I joke. I make that joke every time with ever since Brexit.
Oh yeah, no, it was like basically 2016 was Britain's 1776. But I mean, you guys aren't out of the woods yet. But either way, so yeah. Do you want to continue at least just for like the next 2 minutes at least until we get to the 30 mark before we get in sort of to like the stuff more towards talking about sort of what you see like. Actually, before we'll talk about immigration, and then we'll go on and talk about what we see like sort of the future of the UK. But so would you like to just continue briefly about sort of your evolution of the sort of decline of both British politics and British culture?
I think we pretty much hit the nail on the head. It's just, okay. I think it's just effectively just a sequence of events from one case of like leaving the war. We have this great, wonderful event of like something that we achieved the first time with the World. That I used for the World Cup, but then it was just the aftermath of that and the natural decline of poor decisions. The Cold War, like political allegiances, like I would argue becoming traitors, and the lack of, and this sense and the distinct lack of like wholeness you need in a nation for it to be strong. It was, dare I say, systematically chipped at very specifically at certain points, which led to the hollow mess that we call the United Kingdom. Now,
do you think de-evolution was a mistake?
Well, I mean, the current state of what we see in Scotland and Wales, I would argue yes. And ironically enough, I personally don't want more power going to Westminster. And I would technically argue Westminster, we should have a proper English parliament. I mean, if Scotland and Wales are going to have their own parliaments, why can't we have an English parliament?
Okay, fair enough.
You know, that stuff. But yeah, I mean, at least, I mean, I know that certain people have been constantly sucking up to the Tories, you know, for them so-called BTFOing Labour. But like, even if Labour are in the wilderness now, that's not necessarily a good thing, because that means that the Tories have no proper opposition. Then they can just run riot and just cause an absolute mess.
Honestly, I've always seen, and this might sound a little reductionist on my part, but especially because America, compared to the rest of the Western world, is slightly more to the right, at least just like on average. Like our Republicans are to the right of most conservative parties, quote unquote, in the Western world. But so, like, I mean, the Conservative Party in Britain has always struck me. I mean, maybe they're a little less woke, but they've always struck me on most of their policies as basically being the same as like the your typical not like AOC kind, not like the far left, but just your typical neoliberal Democrats here in the U.S. like that. What would be the centrists? So like the Bill Clintons,
I won't even say Bill Clinton.
Pelosi, maybe.
I would say that. I mean, I would say
or the rhinos, like
Mitt
Romney or John McCain.
I would say they're like a weird. But you know what I said about the Coke Pie? I mean, I would say the current Tory party are like a weird blend of. This is going to sound hilarious: Mitt Romney, Bill Clinton, and Bernie Sanders.
Interesting. The Bernie Sanders. I mean, Mitt Romney and Bill Clinton. I'd argue. So basically, I have this joke: the Reagan administration lasted from 1981 to 2001, because basically Bill Clinton, he continued with the Reagan economic consensus. Which is why Bill Clinton is I think he's a terrible person, but he was a pretty solid president as far as modern presidents go.
Well, I mean, let's be frank here. When it comes to people outside of America, when they think Bill Clinton, all they think about is the blowjob incident.
That's
literally what they think of. But like, the reason why I say all three is because Bill Clinton, I know full well, because he did try and talk big on immigration, but he really did do jack on that.
Oh, he was the one who created. He laid the groundwork for ICE.
That is true, but like, if you really look at his record compared to, let's say, you know, especially from later presidents afterwards, he talked big, but if you look at the numbers, he did not do a good job on that. Like, he talked big about illegal immigration or illegal aliens, as he says, but he did not do a good job. Similar with the Tories, where they talk tough on getting tough on immigration, but they end up being even worse than the Blairites were.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, it makes me laugh when I hear people say Obama was known as the deporter. When you look at his numbers and look at supposedly how many he deported and the illegal immigration numbers in America, either he did not deport that many people, or he did a real bad job of securing the border.
You see, I'd actually argue the opposite. I'd argue that the Republican, because beginning up until 1994, we need to remember the Republicans were the party of mass immigration. And I mean, it sort of started to change in the 80s. The Democrats started kind of warming up to it. I mean, Democrats still called for a wall up until about 2014. But either way, it was the Republicans. Reagan gave amnesty to several million illegal immigrants specifically, and also wanted to basically mass import people from communist countries on top of that.
The mass refugees of I know Cuba, I think,
And and then until the evangelicals came in, the hardcore social conservatives, all conservatism meant in the U.S. like this, starting in the 1960s, was just the reason they were called conservatives: the conservation of classical liberalism. That's basically what it was. You had Goldwater, who was pro legalizing marijuana, pro gay marriage, and generally on social issues, pretty moderate to. I mean, I know not left by today's standards, but pretty liberal by those standards. And then you automatically have, starting in '94 with the so-called Republican Revolution, you had the marriage between the neocons and the evangelicals. And then especially by 2012, I mean, I know Romney was pretty critical of like immigration. He was like the first Republican candidate who really started becoming more of an immigration, or running on an immigration hawk campaign. And then he even had his vice president, Paul Ryan, who was basically for open borders, and pretty much downplayed it when he was speaker because Trump was in charge and he just wanted to suck Trump's mushroom schlong. But I still think, but speaking of the whole Obama thing, Obama did deport more people than Donald Trump. And I mean, he did start the detention camps at the border.
Which a lot of people ignore.
And then I mean, I am very critical of Obama's immigration policy, because my whole thing for immigration, Europe needs less immigration. America, I think, needs a little more immigration. I'm not going to go into reasons why. A lot of it has to do with because they're very different kinds of nations. Whereas a German, just at least if you look at from an identity perspective, a German or an Englishman is not the same as an American. They're not American. It's more of like it's more abstract and ideological, whereas it's more ethnic kind of in Europe. Not necessarily not as much as like in Asia, but there's but it's funny you mention that about America, because I had this argument with somebody. Oh, hello. Sorry about that, ladies. Sorry, that's my smoke detector goes off a lot. Sorry. So hold on. Say what you were saying.
Sorry. I was going to say I did have this argument with a so-called a conservative who's in one of the new small parties, and I argued with him saying that an American conservative is an oxymoron statement.
This is the first Enlightenment nation.
Yeah, because technically speaking, what we know as America, it's ultimately an English/Spanish colony. So
if you Southwest, maybe Spanish.
Yeah, so like if you're talking from the east side, it was predominantly the British, and if you look at politically speaking, it's based off a lot of the British subtext. But then ultimately, like through the south up, you had the Spanish immigration, and then after the so-called, when it was founded, quote unquote, then you had like the expansion towards the west with your fights with the Hispanic, the Mexican/Aztec types. Then you had the mass immigration from like the Germans, escaping like religious persecution and the Napoleon and so on and so forth from, let's say, Germany, France, Italy, Ireland, and so on and so forth, to create modern America. And the issue why I have is when people say you're a conservative, is that to me, if you say you're a conservative, you are saying that you are a traditionalist.
Yes, conservatism in Europe, maybe with the exception of the UK to a slightly lesser extent, conservative in Europe implies traditionalist, throne and altar, sometimes Blut and Bloden. I'm not going to say the English words, but you see that for a lot of the hardcore nationalist parties. And then for the and then when you say liberal, basically means libertarian or classical liberal, or at least a free marketer. Like you could get away with calling Macron a liberal, I guess, sort of. Because he's economically classically liberal in it, but still sort of a statist. And then you have but then if you say you're a social democrat or a socialist, most of the time that's like you have people who say they're like ordo liberals or market or free market Democrats, which is basically Denmark, which is like a free market, but also a large welfare state and unions, because they have less regulation than the U.S., which is interesting.
Well, yeah. Well, this one makes me laugh is that they look what America would call socialist countries are ironically enough the most capitalist countries you'll find.
Precisely.
If you look at raw economics.
And it's kind of like when Bernie Sanders was like, "Oh, we need to be like Denmark. We need Medicare for all, like they had in Denmark." First of all, Medicare is not a thing in Denmark. Second of all, then you had, I think it was that Rasmussen, whoever the PM or president was of Denmark, like 4 years ago. He was like, "No, Denmark is not a socialist country. It is a market economy. We are a free market economy." Bernie Sanders is wrong.
Yeah. But that's the thing, though. He kept pushing this lie, and even if the leader of the country tells you no, you are wrong. But he still tried pushing it. And the thing is, though, is that like this whole idea of universal healthcare. I mean, I've had this argument with numerous Americans. The idea of universal healthcare, technically speaking, does not exist.
Exactly. I mean,
okay. I mean,
you can call it social. You can call it social, like socialized medicine. That's one thing, but universal healthcare, yeah,
because it's not technically speaking truly universal. Even the National Health Service in the UK, it's not technically universal. Because if it was truly universal, people wouldn't be dying waiting for treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's one aspect. In reality, is a lot of American commentators against universal healthcare. They are correct to say it is rationalized. They are correct in a sense when it comes to treatments and resources. It is rationalized.
And but one of the things, this is kind of what bothers me about the right in America. Well, first of all, I don't think anybody. First, the left, they don't know. The American left, most of them, which are like social democrats, they don't really know what socialism is. They hear Bernie Sanders talking about socialism, whereas he's talking more about like Bernie Sanders is basically on the left end of social democracy. I wouldn't even consider him a full-on socialist. I think his ideas are bad, but either way, he's confusing people by calling himself a socialist. And then other people are like, "Oh yeah, I agree with him. I guess I'm a socialist." And then you have other people I call boomer cons, who are basically saying anything that has to do with anything that there's any state involvement in is socialism. Basically, people calling Obama a socialist, people calling Obamacare, which I don't particularly love Obamacare, but I'm not like particularly anti-Obamacare either. Like I'm very indifferent on it. But you have that, which was what we call Obamacare now, aka the individual mandate, which is a market-based system to an extent, but it was. Do you know who created it? It was envisioned. It was first like drafted up, the idea, by the Heritage Foundation, which is the premier American conservative think tank here in the United States.
Yeah,
I've had acquaintances who've interned there before. It's not very far from where I am, but yeah. And then you have people like Newt Gingrich, who was pushing for it. Mitt Romney implemented it on a state level when he was governor of Massachusetts. George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, Milton Friedman sort of was warm to the idea. And then you have people now, just because the Democrats are started pushing for it as a compromise, they're like, "Oh, Obama's like a socialist. He's like a far leftist." It's like, no, he's just a basic bitch, like corporatist neoliberal type.
Exactly. And but this is the thing, though, is that a lot of Americans do not understand the healthcare systems that Europe have. And I've had massive amounts of arguments with so-called autistic Democrat voters, not understanding how it works. And I've had to get in certain political groups, and I've had to get other Europeans involved from like France, Germany, Netherlands, etc., stating, no, what I say is correct. This is how our system works. We know because we actually live here, we use it, we know how it works. And there's, and they're like, no, you're lying. I'm like, dude, you live in freaking Michigan and you've never been outside Michigan. Get on a plane and come over to Europe and you'll see exactly what the deal is.
And a lot of the reason too why they have it over there, well, two reasons. Number one, they don't have giant empires to manage.
That's one aspect.
Yeah. Number two, or actually there's three. Number two, their population's nowhere near as large as the United States. And number 3, there is more ethnic homogeneity over there. And generally speaking, this is an empirical fact. Mind you, I don't want to get into like the whole race stuff. I think like stuff like race realism is dumb. And when people talk about like, oh, biological realities, it's usually just a cover up to talk about more sinister things. But either way, it is true though that different people who like people of the same ethnic group have closer biological makeup, which is including immune systems as well, and that is a major part of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I hear people speak of biological essentialism nowadays, it's more referring to the T lobby.
Oh, what's the T lobby?
The trans lobby.
Oh, well, true. That's what it's sort of becoming.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is though, is that like I know someone who I speak to quite a bit, who's big into genetic research.
Okay.
And some of the recent discoveries he's found and shared with me, some of the genetic discoveries he's found through like genetic research is utterly astounding. The funniest one, I'm sure you've come across the "we was Kangs" talking crap regarding like Africans and stuff like Egypt.
Afrocentrism.
Yeah. Well, here's what's really funny. You heard of the pharaoh Tutankhamun by any chance?
He was Akhenaten's son, right?
I believe so.
I know Akhenaten, he was the one who tried to create a monotheist, like Egypt, and then his son died at like 19 or something.
Yeah. This is what's really funny. Tutankhamun, it turned out, genetically speaking, was, and I quote, 100% Western European.
Interesting.
But this is what was also funny. They found that Tutankhamun's DNA, 70%, the average Brit shared 70% of genetic DNA with Tutankhamun. When they compared that to average Egyptians, it was around 50% at best.
Okay, because I know like you have like major civilizations, like because civilizations like by definition include a bunch of smaller cultures and the ethnic or ethno-linguistic at least groups. I mean, you had Egyptian civilization, which covered like Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, very different culturally. Some Semitic areas up until at one point it extended up into Canaan, and then also Nubia, Ethiopia, all influenced, very like racially diverse. All had like a common. They shared a common culture. But I mean, but the core stock originally, like of the Egyptians, they were an ethno linguistic group that doesn't exist anymore. I think it was they spoke like Hamitic. I think that's what it. And when I say like Hamite, I don't mean it in like the original race realist sense. I mean it in the traditional cultural sense. The name of the group, of course, being named after Ham from the Bible, Noah's son or whatever. But yeah, no, it was they were not black. They were not Indo-Aryan. They were Indo-European. Get around the censors. They were not Semitic. So like the Arabs or Babylonians, they were their own thing. Like there's absolutely no link culturally speaking or linguistically speaking between modern Egypt and ancient Egypt. Exactly, and I mean, like they just so happen to be there, and they occupy the same place. Like, cool, you inherit all these awesome cultural sites. Great on you. Similar to like Iraq with the ziggurats, but it's not a continuous culture in the same way as like China or India. But you have the ancient Egyptian, and this is what. And so to get into, maybe we should get into talk a little bit about some of the woke stuff going on. But you see people. I think it was Gal Gadot, who's Israeli, was recently cast as Cleopatra in a movie coming up. Honestly, I think Cleopatra's overplayed. They should have done Hatshepsut or something.
Cleopatra's the one everyone knows, and I saw the outrage to it, and they're expecting, wait, she should be black. And I'm like, dude, ancient Egyptians were very close to Greeks, and technically speaking, is that those from, let's say, as far west as Greece to Egypt to, dare I say, as far east as, let's say,
Afghanistan in some areas.
In Afghanistan.
Afghani Greek kingdoms,
Their genetic lineage, also known as Indo-European, they have a lot of genetics. They do have quite a lot of genetic relations between each other.
And then you had
basically obviously, sorry to interrupt, but this is why it was fairly acceptable for a quote unquote Israeli to play an Egyptian rather than someone from Senegal playing an Egyptian, especially in that time period.
I mean, if they play a Nubian, that makes sense, like, because they were sort of on the periphery of Egyptian civilization. But you had, but for instance, I don't even consider Cleopatra to be an ancient Egyptian. I consider her to be Hellenic. Like, she was part of the Greco-Roman culture, and by that point, the traditional ancient Egyptian, quote unquote, Hamitic civilization began around 3300 BC. I think it really only lasted until 700 BC. Entire traditional empires fell apart, and then you had like all these ruling peoples that came, and then Alexander the Great comes in. And Cleopatra was Greek. I mean, some of the pharaohs at the time had blonde hair. It's just they were overlords. I mean,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's just true as well. And the problem is the woke types seem to think everyone in Africa, everyone who lives in Africa is somehow black. When anyone who's ever met anyone from like, especially Northern Africa, they are not black. They are like closer to Persians than they are to Persians and Arabs.
It's like Babylonians and Arabs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also say Persian in there because that's more the Western side of things.
Yeah, I'd say Persians more related to, I think, Europeans and Indians, at least from an ethno-linguistic. Yeah,
somewhat, yes, but like, for instance, if you say Persia, technically there is an element of overlap between the Persians and the Arabs.
Definitely culturally, yes, 100%.
Yeah. So and they don't seem to understand that, and this proves that the regressives, as I refer to them as, or the wokerati, which I think is a funnier term, they just shows how utterly ignorant they are of the world around them.
Sorry, continue.
Yeah, and I was just going to say as well, like, when it comes to like films and casting people based on certain ethnicities, there's a certain amount of outside a certain ethnic group you can cast and quote unquote respect the role in question. But the woke types are like, yes, we'll have a black Anne Boleyn, despite there's no genetic or historical evidence to say Anne Boleyn was black.
And then you also had like a Netflix series or something that was like based on the Iliad or something, and they cast the black man as I think Achilles. And
and even
in the Iliad, it says he has blonde hair, blue eyes.
Yeah, exactly. Blonde hair, blue eyes, which clearly means that, genetically speaking, he would have been closer to like modern Scandinavians than anyone from sub-Saharan Africa.
Exactly, because I mean, by that point, like late Bronze Age Greece, that's when you started having these sort of more northern Indo-European tribes come in and supplant the traditional like Minoans and Mycenaeans and cultural mix. Like they basically became like the Achaean Empire that's depicted in the Iliad, the ones who sacked Troy in the mid 13th century BC. Yeah, exactly. And then you also have, exactly. Like, I mean, what would make sense though is, because I think you need to take it on a case by case basis. Like, let's say you made a movie about the Roman Empire, a movie about Marcus Aurelius. You could cast a Syrian because that would be historically accurate.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean that is fair, because
or Turk or something like that. Because I mean, a lot of Rome was a very not necessarily multicultural, but I mean, empires are
multiracial. It was multiracial, definitely. Exactly.
Empires are multiracial by definition, by necessity. Because you have.
I mean, if I remember correctly, it stretched as far west as Britain to as far east as, I think, Iraq or Syria, one of the two.
Like the border of Iraq, yeah.
Yeah. So as far north as I think the highest north it went to, I think, was like North Germany. I might be wrong on that.
But as far as I don't think it touched
Ethiopia. I don't think it touched Scandinavia, but I might be wrong on that.
It was like basically the frontier was like northern Bavaria.
Which is fair. Yeah, and so that was like East Germany, so Southeast Germany, and I think it went to as far south as, let's say, North Africa, maybe slightly below that.
I think it was more like Ethiopia. Actually, like, I mean, it was mostly North Africa. It was like mostly the border of the Sahara, but then once you got to Egypt, because of the Nile, it extended a little further south.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you think that is quite a big range of people, and you think at the time, I mean, especially when you, so if you were going to cast stuff in terms of Romans, you gotta. This is why I respect when it comes to films and TV shows, where they have done tons of research in terms of the roles and get people who fit the characters, who fit the sort of quote unquote ethnic and sort of aesthetical look to the cast in question. So, for instance, like for good example, Gladiator, you have a lot of like, for instance, Joaquin Phoenix is the Emperor. He's obviously
beginning of the end.
Yeah, he's obviously of a Latin heritage, so it makes perfect sense to cast him in a role.
Well, he's half Syrian though, because his father was Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, exactly. You know, perfect example. You know,
then you had African emperors too, not necessarily black, but like Moorish. So like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I
mean, a good example, if they were to do anything in that time period, get someone from Sicily.
Yeah.
You know,
and then if they just so happen to discover, hey, there was a Roman emperor who was like, I don't know, half black or whatever, like it's like, okay, once we prove that historically, by all means, like show that, like show people that is historical fact. And another interesting thing is the patron saint, I think, of like the one who began to Christianize Germany severely, Saint Jerome. It's very likely that he was from Ethiopia, which is interesting. And all the traditional German paintings depict him as having very dark skin.
Yeah, that's fair as well. But like, but that's the thing about history, is that, especially with pictures, they tell. Although they may say, "Oh, it's a portrait," it's like a picture. But quite often, if you pay close attention, it tells more about. There's much more that's being told in the painting that people don't realize. Like, for instance, if you look at, let's say, certain paintings of, let's say, certain people who were the head of the monarchy in the UK, if you pay close attention to a lot of paintings, you can tell that certain ones definitely had genetic defects based on the paintings in question. For instance.
So speaking of like, for instance, history and the movies and all that stuff, to tie it into the conversation on Britain, let's talk about British media right now, the state of British media. And would you say that there is, because you have the I occasionally, I'm not like one of his, I'm not a cultist of his. I've been watching him for like 6 years. I used to really like him, but then I sort of just kind of outgrew him, but I still find him entertaining to watch. But now, of course, they're the Lotus Eaters. But Carl Benjamin, for instance, he's talking, like, he always talks about how British media is super woke. How accurate is his characterization of that, or do you think he's overplaying it because he is playing a character more or less?
Well, here's the thing. If you were to, for instance, I would argue in terms of the mainstream media, I'm talking like BBC, Daily Mail, The Guardian, etc. I would argue there's not really an out-and-out right-wing media company. Now, I know some people will say the Telegraph's right-wing, the Sun is right-wing. Well, the Telegraph is basically...
The Sun's pretty woke now, from what I've seen.
Yeah. Like, the Sun, they're just basically shit stirrers. They're just a shit stirring paper.
Tabloid, yeah.
Yeah, typical shit stirring tabloid.
Maybe, honestly, maybe the Spectator. I mean, but they're more of like they're more like libertarian economics. They're basically not Charles Murray, Douglas Murray types.
Yeah, but the thing is, true. But the thing is, Douglas Murray, I don't call him a conservative. I call him a gay liberal, because that's what he ultimately is.
Classical,
but at the same time, I hate the fact that he ended up releasing a book saying neoconservatism, why we need it. Douglas,
he's had some good books.
That is the reason why we have the mess in the Middle East right now.
Precisely.
It's like, no, that's not what we need. But I would argue there's no out-and-out right-wing media corporation, technically. That big ones. I'm not counting, like, for instance...
Isn't Andrew Neil creating one?
Oh, the GB News, is it? Well, that hasn't gone live yet. That hasn't
Morgan is going to go on it.
Yeah. that hasn't gone live yet. And personally, I'm almost certain, I believe AA said this as well in one of the streams about this subject. I'm pretty certain he said that's going to be controlled opposition.
Yeah, I think, oh God, I think it was Academic Agent was talking about why it's good that it's being created, because it's going to create a fake right wing that will sort of divert attentions away from the dissident types.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's why I say it's controlled opposition, much like where Fox News is basically pretty much by the end of the Trump administration.
They're probably going to be the left of Fox News, though, knowing UK politics.
Possibly, yeah, but I digress. But
yeah,
I mean, even then, if you look at, let's say, what Carl's doing with Lotus Eaters, is you've got what's his name, Maya Tulsi, with his sort of semi-media group thing he's doing. Best of Britain, is it, or something like that? But he's doing his own thing, and obviously the left's equivalent with like I'm literally a communist, Ash Sarkar with Navarro.
I wanted to bring her up. I shouldn't say it on stream, but I had something funny I wanted to say about Ash Sarkar afterwards.
Oh, that she is literally a mentally handicapped individual.
I don't think she's mentally handicapped, but I think she's insane, and that sort of plays into what I want to.
Exactly what I said. I used the political correct term of mentally defected.
Okay, like I mean, I think she's like, I think basically she could be a midwit if she weren't a communist.
Oh, she is definitely chief material for midwit. I mean, especially when I hear some of the videos where she I thought it was hilarious that she quote unquote copied Ben Shapiro's talking point of facts don't care about your feelings on Question Time, and she literally did an emotional statement. I'm like, dear,
I'm literally a communist.
Yeah, I'm like I wish I was there on Good Morning Britain when she said that, because I would have turned around and said, so you're literally economically and historically defected.
I remember it was she was on Good Morning Britain, and this was hilarious. Basically she was it was Piers Morgan, who's basically a boomer con. But I mean he's been okay with at least on the cultural front. I'm not a fan of his, but I don't see a reason to hate him. But he basically had his whole was questioning her. It's like, oh, you're like promoting like this toxic woke culture, and she's like, what is woke culture? And then you had her create her video for her communist media group or whatever, and she was explaining what woke culture is, and it was like completely contradicting herself. Like I don't think she's not.
No, trust me, they're all idiots. They're all hypocritical idiots. I mean, if you want an example, just watch a stream on Vosh. One stream on Vosh, you'll see how many times he contradicts himself.
Yeah, I mean, Vosh can be an okay debater, but
he's not actually a good debater.
I never said good. I said okay. He's good at pretending to be a good debater.
But I mean, he people think he's a good debater because how much BS he speaks, and it's very hard to keep track of him. So he just throws red herrings left, right, and center. He does basically the kamikaze Zulu tactic of a debate, where he throws so many freaking red herrings and BS statements that you're trying to go back and freaking cancel all of them.
Yeah,
that's what he does. Sargon, I've even said this to him directly to his face, that he's a terrible debater and I should be his debate partner. Because after that debate stream, where it was him, Nick Fuentes, Destiny, and
Richard Spencer,
Hassan Piker. The one I'm talking about.
God, it was Hassan Piker's got to be.
It was them four. Yeah, it was them four. I forget who was the host. I forget who the host was. It was on Twitch. It was like 4 hours long. And obviously he did the whole MEP camp thing, and this was an event before he started. Okay, I'll just wait for you to get back. I see Jedi Knight Anna Queen Cringe is here to join us. Welcome aboard. I hope you and Ginger Monsters enjoying what we've had to say so far. And yeah, well, I'll just wait for Political Correct to get back.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I was
I know the thing with my folks. So anyway, as I was saying, yeah. So after that 4 hour debate, I mean, I know the first subject they talked about was about trans in the military, and like it went on for 4 hours, and some of the utterly stupid takes that were said on almost all four contestants. I'm just like, I wish I was there, because that 4 hour debate would have been done in about 30 minutes.
I know you had Nick Fuentes who was saying definitely something. This is my guess. I've not seen this. Nick Fuentes, who's not only being anti-trans, but who's also being trollishly anti-trans to like what would be considered an offensive degree. Then you have, I'm guessing, Vosh, who actually no, I'll not come to Vosh. Then you'll have Sargon, who's saying, "Oh, trans people should be able to do what they want, but no gender transition before the age of 18," which is extremely reasonable, I'd say. And then you have probably Vosh, who's saying anybody should be able to be doing his whole.
Well, Vosh wasn't there, but
so then Hassan Piker would probably be doing that.
Yeah. Sorry, Darth Killhorn, I didn't see you there. Yeah. So, but yeah, like them four. It was just some of the. I forget what the other two were, but I remember I was in a certain political group I was in, just commenting. I was watching it and I was making comments as I was going along, and you could. And if you were there, you could see how much I was starting to wanting to pull my hair out with some of the utterly stupid takes. The funniest take, I will say, was Hassan Piker when he said, and I quote, "Profit is theft."
By definition, no. Okay, so what's even dumber than that is people who say property is theft.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, do we want to get on to why I should be Supreme Emperor of the island?
Let's move on to that. Just like in 5 minutes. I just wanted to kind of finish the whole thing about the woke stuff going on. Do you think does the British public actually? So I want to do the woke thing, then briefly Brexit and Boris Johnson, and then we end with your thing.
Sure thing. Yeah.
Okay. So with the whole like woke thing, I see right now, and it makes me sad. Like, I mean, I'm fine with like LGBT, like gay marriage, all that stuff. Like, I see no reason to be against it. I'm basically I mean, I just believe everybody should get married, just in general. That's my personal take. But
so you're in the same camp as Sargon, technically.
Yes, I just believe marriage is a good institution, and it's better that two people who are gay, two gay people get married than not, and just like live a single. Either way. Plus, I think it's just more fulfilling from like a personal level, and I think it's like that for everyone. It's like a perennial truth. But either way, so I have no problem with that, and I support the Anglican Church's stance on that. However, my current problem with the Anglican Church, as somebody who is a confirmed member of the Episcopal Church in the United States, which is the same thing, my problem is it seems like a lot of them are focusing. I'm just generally anti-politics in church in general, as long as it's like an issue that really has to do with something that is fundamentally has to do with morality. But for instance, like churches flying like the LGBT flag, I think that's really that is like them making a political statement. I think they should focus on the theology. And right now you have the Church of England, which is toying with spreading like woke stuff right now, and it kind of makes me sad. It's like, don't be like those evangelical megachurch pastors who shill for Trump. Don't push for like left-wing policies. I mean, the acceptance aspect is fine, but don't like go and advertise it. Don't make it part of your brand. And I sort of start seeing that with certain aspects of the Church of England sort of becoming joining that mechanism.
Well, yeah, because they're basically, I mean, I forget who said it best, but they're the so-called right political, in terms of the right wing who are actually in office. Well, not just in terms of Parliament or in the Senate or Congress. They are just going around the left on the so-called the opponent's agenda at a lower speed. That's all they're doing. They're not actually being in opposition.
Okay.
Like, because ultimately, like, they don't really oppose them on absolutely anything. Now, on the subject question on whether the public is woke or not, well, based on I think it was a video either today, I believe it was, or it might have been yesterday, on the Lotus's YouGov asked a question about, are you woke? 2/3 of the public, when questioned this, said no. But the problem is the majority of the British public don't even know what woke is. But basically, it was on average just under 2-1 we're against it.
But then again, they need to define woke. Like, I mean, because you could have somebody who's like, oh yeah, I'm like.
Look, I mean, I've come up. I remember when I was in a debate group before I decided to leave because they were being certain people were being super cancerous and hypocrites and just constantly just getting me various fucking speech bans from being able to communicate in general. Basically, being woke basically means you are living a life of pure hypocrisy in the name of virtue.
Okay.
So if I gave an example of how someone's woke, I'll say it's very simple: claiming to support LGBT while at the same time defending Islam.
Yes, that's a good example.
The Chinese quite literally made a term for it called Baizao, which it literally refers to as the white left.
And exactly, and there is a sort of, and I think it comes from that that just sense of Western guilt, which I mean, a lot of people say a lot of people
like that.
Yeah, a lot of people say, oh, the whole idea of Western guilt came after World War II. I'd actually argue it's been. This is a completely different conversation, but I'd argue it's kind of the seeds have been there since the beginning. And of course, this isn't me bashing Christianity, but I think it does have its roots in sort of the Christian theology, because Western civilization has always been more guilt-based, whereas Eastern civilization has always been way more shame-based. And I think that's
guilt and shame are, two sides of the same.
They're kind of inverse. But like what I mean is, for instance, it's more shame is more of an external thing, whereas guilt is a more internal thing. It has the individualism aspect.
Yeah, I mean, the good example where you could argue so-called liberal white guilt played this role. It's how Gandhi basically shamed the British to leave India.
Well,
he straight up did it through shaming tactics. I
mean, Gandhi was definitely more moderate than a lot of the other ones. Like, I mean, there's this whole meme going on right now, and I know, Voltaire's ghost, right?
Oh yeah, I know of him. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Voltaire's ghost did a video on this where it's like there are these people, because I mean, basically, a lot of people on the British left right now, pretty much, and I'm not even being facetious here. So for instance, I don't think Bernie Sanders hates America like a lot of people on the right say, but I do legitimately think people like Jeremy Corbyn hate Britain.
I would argue Bernie Sanders is a useful idiot, and Jeremy Corbyn is a useful idiot. Is a useful idiot who does actually quite hate this island.
Yeah, and I do. But either way, I mean, The Guardian pretty much is like the most anti-British magazine that there is.
Newspaper, yeah. It makes me laugh. It makes me laugh when they talk about virtue. It makes me laugh when they talk about virtue, when it turned out, thanks to certain incidents that happened last year, I found out that they were founded by a slave owner.
Oh yeah.
Who was against the abolishment of slavery.
Which is
using the people who worked their own logic, that would make every single person who worked for them a supporter of slavery. So therefore, Mr. Owen Jones, cough up your repatriations, you slave-owning imperialist fascist.
Yeah, basically they basically have like a bunch of articles like, should the British Empire really be a source for pride? I mean, honestly, my answer is just yes. Rule Britannia.
Well, on that point, I've had this argument with loads of people. Why is it a-okay to slag off the British for the British Empire, but nobody does this to the Turks with the Ottomans or the Italians with the Romans?
Because they're not part of Western culture. I'm not even going to make it a racial thing. I mean, they're not like Anglo-Saxons or French or
me personally, I think it's just blatant. I think it's just blatant Anglophobia. That's
maybe not. I think it's just it's extreme, uncalled for, irrational guilt. And Murray was talking about this in The Strange Death of Europe. It's like the West hasn't done anything that other civilizations that are not vilified for haven't done. Like, for instance, you can, I think it's good to take accountability. And I think in a lot of ways, moderately taking accountability without berating, without like self-flagellation and saying, okay, yeah, we screwed up here, saying stuff like that. I think that's good. That's a noble thing to do. as long as you're nuanced, like saying, maybe the conquistador, but then I think that's where morally a lot of Western people, like in a sense, they take it too far. But I think that's where they sort of rise above like some other cultures from a moral perspective. But then you have these other ones which aren't apologizing for anything. Nobody criticizes them for that, and
my mentality is okay, cool, fine. You can criticize it, but don't be a hypocrite.
Precisely.
Be consistent and criticize the Ottoman Empire. Hell, what about the Islamic Empire? You know, you want to complain about the Brits with slavery? Why don't you attack the Islamic slave trade that went on for literally near enough a millennium?
Which began laid the ground roots for transatlantic slave trade, which of course the Europeans are at fault for establishing, but they were just taking a model of African slavery that had been being used by the Islamic Empire since 9th century, sometime around there.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but this is something that really annoys me. It's like, we literally spent like 40%. We took out a giant loan to end slavery, which took 200 years to pay back. And that's considering that we had 2 world wars and multiple economic recessions, and we still paid it back in 2015.
They literally, the British, I mean, I'd say that is a very, maybe not fiscally responsible, but from a moral perspective, noble. Like basically, the British Empire bankrupted itself trying to end slavery worldwide, like not just within their empire, but also pressuring other countries, including the United States.
Exactly. I mean, but this is the ironic thing is that if you look at the countries which still have slavery to this day, and there is some very questionable how they come to the definition of slavery, but the countries that are quote unquote listed, ironic enough, they're also nations that you don't see the left criticize, such as China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, just to name a few. Yep. I mean, the way I see it is that one aspect that ironically did help kill off the slave trade, in a sense, I would dare argue, with the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, basically made, like, you had those people who were like for abolition before that. They were seen as not necessarily by some extremists, but then by some they were definitely in the minority. And then you had most of the people, including a lot of the founding fathers, who were like, we're going to like philosophically criticize slavery, but because we see it's definitely it is morally questionable. And then, but they're like, at the same time, there's a practical reason, because the thing is, it was about energy. Like that was what motivated slavery. It wasn't like and I think, morally reprehensible slavery was definitely, but then at the same time, the prime motivator was they needed an energy source and human labor that was thousands of years. That's what it was. Like, that's just
the truth. There is that.
And then you had the ones who were just kind of indifferent on the issue. Those ones, and then the other ones I just mentioned were were like the majority of the people. And then you had another smaller minority who were like hardcore in favor of slavery, which are like the mercantilists. But then the Industrial Revolution came around, and then more people opened up to like, okay, slavery is immoral. We don't need it anymore. It became a net drain on these imperial economies.
Well, of course, you're literally paying. This is just this is one aspect of basic economics, and this is like one of the major reasons why I'm completely against mass migration. Like it frustrates me where the left and even aspects of the right are like, we can import in labor. I was like, guess what? Okay, you import in that labor. What happens when all that labor gets to a point they decide to pack up? Then what? What, are you going to continue even more importing it, overloading the infrastructure to the point where the whole thing collapses? I mean, there's a few people out there who I think are actually actively doing this, and I can think of a few names who are actively doing this, and those people, do not deserve any sense of respect at all. But I don't think they really saw this. I don't think they've actually even thought about this from a logical standpoint. I mean, me personally, this is why, economic speaker, I call myself an economic nationalist or a national capitalist, whatever the correct term is. As in, there's no genuine logic to importing mass amounts of people, displacing your own people, because ultimately, there is an argument to say it was those types of policies which helped end up collapsing the Roman Empire. And obviously, I don't know the full history of that aspect, but I mean, if you're going to,
I definitely want to have a stream on immigration coming up at some point.
Yeah,
part
sure.
of my main show, not like just a conversation. But since we're sort of coming to the end, to say first, let's talk about briefly talk about Brexit and the current conservative government, and then we'll end by you proposing your interesting fixes.
Yeah. Well, on the Brexit itself, I mean, the negotiations, to re-paraphrase what I was saying earlier, the negotiations were a joke. The final deal, from what I understand, was basically remain on inferior terms. It's just a joke. We're still paid them so much money, which we don't even owe them. It was just an utter crap show, and it was clear, and it was blatantly deliberate. And it made me laugh how so many people, and I'm going to include Sargon in this, bought this. And I remember saying to him in person, why the hell would you buy anything these people say when it's blatantly obvious that they're not going to do it? I mean, it was obvious. I mean, hell, like, if I can see it, and I don't even have the sort of, and I don't even put the amount of research into content, I don't even put the amount of time in research into books or economics like people like Sargon do. If I can see something, then what the hell's the excuse for these people?
Okay.
You know, I mean, it's an utter joke.
The funniest thing for me, well, two things. The first thing is just because they so happen to coincide, and just because Brexit, there were like a lot of people who fed up. Nobody was expecting Brexit to happen. All these people who are comparing Brexit and saying, "Oh, this the whole Brexit thing. It is the equivalent to Donald Trump." It's like I don't see any correlation between. I mean, maybe some of it from like certain elements. Like the populist element, but that's about it.
Well, the thing is, the main correlation between Donald Trump and Brexit is it was a quote-unquote public voting revolt, democratically speaking, against the establishment. Because Brexit, ultimately, the people who voted Brexit, it was predominantly the people who wanted Brexit. The main people who were against Brexit and would remain was the establishment.
I'd say Donald Trump is proof that democracy works.
Well. I mean,
I'm not. I definitely have my criticisms of like mass democracy in that sense, but I mean that doesn't mean it doesn't work.
Well, I would argue no country on this planet is a democracy, and so-called quote-unquote real democracy has never been tried.
I'd say okay, maybe a better way to say it, republic with voting with democratic institutions.
Yeah,
lowercase d.
Yeah, well, as my case, I'd say if democracy truly existed in any country, the overwhelming majority of policies and actions taken by the government would never have happened.
And then you also see the more and more democratic countries become, the more and more they expand the franchise. The closer and closer they come to authoritarianism, when eventually you have like a bunch of people who all rally behind a strongman who they see as an extension of their will, more or less. You've seen in pretty much. I mean, there has never been a democracy that has not committed suicide.
Well, I mean, again, I would argue
is the fulfillment of democracy, basically.
Well, I would argue real democracy has never been tried, but that's just me. But then again, my concept of democracy, a lot of people seem to think democracy is the ability to vote, which doesn't mean that. Not even the great.
That's the democratic process, but not democracy itself.
No. The actual concept of democracy itself, if you take the literal definition of the word democracy and where the word translates from, it literally translates to power of the people.
That's why I like make a distinction between uppercase democracy and lowercase d democracy.
Yeah. For me, when I hear the word democracy, I'm thinking pure, unrivaled tyranny of the public, of the majority view by the public.
I think
that's what it means in action.
The closest major power to come near that, I would say, to a lesser extent, the First French Republic, and then to a much larger extent, the late Roman Republic, as they expanded like the rights to the plebeians and stuff.
Maybe, but like for me, it's like even the most quote unquote democratic country in the world, Switzerland. Their last referendum hasn't, technically speaking, been honored, from what I understand. Although it's been a while since I looked into it. And that was the referendum on free movement. I mean, because the Swiss there, like I mean, what's hilarious, back in the early 90s, they had a referendum on increasing the price of petrol and diesel, or gasoline, as you in America would call it, and they voted in favor to increase it, and it was honored.
Yeah, that's why. And I'm like, definitely a double-edged sword there. But either way, just on terms of like back to Brexit, what I found very egregious, and a lot of people here in the United States bought it because they're just hearing like one source, which is usually the BBC, coming from. And generally, I liked the BBC. Pre 2015, it was generally pretty moderate, at least from what I viewed. But then after that, especially beginning with Brexit, it may be more of an establishment thing. They started saying, "Oh yeah, Brexit was like all the racists voted for Brexit," and they're saying, "Oh, Brexit is racist," which is even more ridiculous than saying everybody who voted for Donald Trump was racist, because Donald Trump. I mean, I'm not like a orange man bad type guy, but I mean, there are some things that could be interpreted as dog whistles, and the alt-right did support Donald Trump. I mean, just at least out of pragmatism. But but Brexit was not. It was not an inherently anti-immigrant platform. But
here's the thing. Another aspect was something that really pisses me off with the English language: the word racist. Literally, almost nobody even knows what the definition of the word racist means.
Ever since the 70s, they've been trying to redefine it to mean prejudice plus power now, instead of just hatred of people, other races.
Yeah, which is funny because, ironic enough, the best dictionary in the world, the Oxford English Dictionary, makes no reference to prejudice plus power. And to give you the exact definition, as it's written right now, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership of a particular racial or ethnic group. Typically one that is a minority or marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, technically speaking, if you were to take that exact definition and apply it in and to see who is the most racist, who do you think would fit the description the most?
I would say, at least from an unintentional perspective, maybe white liberals.
Yes, what you call white liberals. Yeah,
I say the very pander, at least in the sort of their not white supremacists in the like Richard Spencer quote unquote alt-right white national sense, but they are in the sort of we have this burden, we just take up the white man's burden, kind of like and I know Kipling didn't mean it in it. I know Kipling meant it, and actually it was seen as a very progressive message at the time, the white man's burden, but it's sort of nowadays like it's basically that same thing, that just very patronizing, just sort of like we need to protect you because we have the power. We need to like uplift you because you guys don't have any agency. You guys are just not as strong as, and we're going to be your protector. Like exactly, it's very condescending. And I've talked to people of color about this too, even like people who would be associated with like groups like BLM, who have been like, yeah, no, that's honestly, they've told me themselves, yeah, that's more, in a sense, that's more racist than like the shit than like, basically you have people who are calling the boomer cons, like Ben Shapiro boomer cons, and Ben Shapiro's cringe, don't get me wrong, but people are calling him a racist. But then you have, these people, like I was saying, the sort of BLM aligned people are saying, yeah, no, comparatively speaking, it's the white liberal elite.
Well, yeah, but this is the thing. Like, I believe it was Majid Nawaz who made the point. The progressive left, or as he calls them now, the regressive left, are full of bigotry of low expectations.
Yeah, he coined that term, didn't he? Before it was ruined by Dave Rubin.
Most probably, yeah, but they are technically the polite, politically correct version of white supremacy.
Yeah, and also completely oblivious to the fact that they.
I think some of them actually do realize it, and they're just playing as an act for some of them.
Possibly one of the reasons Richard Spencer voted straight Democratic ticket.
Well, yeah, but again, Richard Spencer's controlled opposition, and he's a blatant
and a Fed. He's definitely a Fed.
I mean, how can a so-called white supremacist have a Twitter account?
That's fair.
Exactly, that proves my point. Exactly, so it proves that he was controlled opposition, like many people are. But yeah, and also the whole anti-immigrant thing. Well, technically speaking, even you could look at opinion polls as far back as the mid 1950s. Immigration has been a big talking point in this country for a very long time.
Ever since Ernie Poggers or Ernie Panders, pretty much.
Well, ever since
even before that, yeah.
Yeah, during Windrush, people did not support it. We did not support it. And this is where I jokingly say, well, if democracy was enforced, Britain would not be as ethnically diverse today if democracy was enforced. Because they would have said no to Windrush, no to any form of mass migration whatsoever. They were very much against it. And, people say about, oh, this is the failure of democracy. I'm like, no, this has nothing to do with the failure of democracy. This is the reality of aristocracy in action. But as for the whole, just the deal itself, I mean, I don't expect it to be a roaring success, to be honest, with the current leaders. I mean, hell, if I was negotiating as Supreme Emperor, it would have been a roaring success, so much so that Donald Trump would have to re-release his book after the deal.
And then what I thought the dumbest part was, you had the Lib Dems who were they tried calling for a people's vote, and it's like, no, that's dumb. That's what the referendum was. It's like, you're having a referendum to see if you can nullify the referendum. It's like, no, you lost. I mean, it's you went into it thinking you'd win. You win some, you lose some. You lost this one. And then at the same time, I mean, I've talked to plenty of European mainlanders. And what's interesting is, so I've talked, comparatively speaking, I know more, at least let's say, I don't know the amount I've talked to, but let's say that the number of people from the UK I've talked to is 10. The number of people from the mainland I've talked to is 10. Like 7 out of 10 European mainlanders. Again, this is just a rough estimate, just basically to get my point across, have been like, I think Brexit is going to be better for both the continent and for the UK, with only maybe 3 of them saying, oh no, I think Brexit's bad. Whereas it's almost the reverse for the UK. But then again, the people of the UK I'm talking to are the more sort of corporate, liberal aligned ones who I've talked to, or Guardian types or whatever. But what's interesting, I don't know, it's just kind of interesting, at least from the people I've talked to. I've met more European mainlanders who think Brexit's a good thing than vice versa. And then a lot of those ones are just typical French Macron style liberals, German Christian Democrats, people like that. Because I mean, the thing is, I think the UK is the only country that could really pull it off, as opposed to Ital exit, that would be a disaster. But Brexit, for instance, their economy is decades ahead of the rest of Europe. It's been like that since the Industrial Revolution, where the Industrial Revolution began. It is much more likely to succeed than any other country in doing that. And it doesn't mean they're cutting off the relationship altogether. It just means that they have more autonomy economically and politically. There's probably still going to be quote unquote free trade deals with the EU, especially France. I mean, that's not going anywhere. But it's just going to give the UK more agency in order to, I know they won't become a superpower ever again, or at least not unless you take over, which we'll get to here in a second. But,
I mean,
but it's at least going to gain some significant economic and global power if handled right in going down within the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't have very high hopes on the future personally. I generally don't. And that's not to give red pills to anyone who's in Britain who believes this. Like, I generally am quite a pessimistic person. The only thing I am optimistic about, and this is definitely nothing related to Brexit, is just the evolution and improvements in regards to technology. That's the only thing I'm optimistic about.
Technology is the only thing that progresses. The only
exactly. I mean, hell, I'm a massive progressive when it comes to technology.
No, it's the only place where the Whig theory of history has ever proven to be correct so far.
Exactly.
Technology, yeah.
Exactly. So, but yeah, I'm not massively optimistic. I mean, right now, I'm just trying to get as much solid foundations as possible in terms of a home, my I've got pretty secure employment right now, despite all the crap with COVID, and that subject has got me so angry.
Okay, why don't you talk about COVID here for a second?
Well, I mean, as of right now, so I don't give false information. Well, actually, we shouldn't say COVID. We should say when it comes to that subject, the experts are always 100% right. They are never ever wrong, and don't you dare contradict the experts, because if you try and contradict them, you will be silenced. Winky face.
So I think that
yeah.
So with this, I don't really like
sarcasm, by the way.
Yeah, I know. For some reason, I think they definitely can be wrong. However, at least for the majority of them, unless they are like super political ones or they're by the WHO, and the WHO is compromised. It's an extension of the Chinese government. But but unless they are from the WHO, I really don't think that these experts are particularly malicious. I just think they here and there they might get things wrong, especially early on. We were trying to learn things about, like, first of all, they were like, oh, don't go out and buy masks or something like that. But then they were like, oh, wait, actually, maybe masks are a good idea. But then they're saying, oh, it's only going to be a few weeks to flatten the curve. And then they were talking about the lockdowns. And I can see at least a practical argument for the initial lockdown. We should not be locked down nearly as long as we are. And you guys are still locked down, which is crazy. But I've been seeing these.
Not quite lockdown per se.
Okay. I mean, my state actually didn't really do a lockdown. It was basically like there were businesses that were deemed essential and then semi-essential. The semi-essential ones were able to stay open so long as they either did some of them were allowed to, they had like a maximum amount of people that could come in, or they could do like curbside, like a curbside type thing. But in the company that I currently work for their let's call them distribution centers, did something like that too, like a curbside type thing. But either way, my state did not. It was actually pretty reasonable. But either way, what's interesting now is I'm starting to see this sort of unintentional liberal anti-vax thing going on right now, where it's like the whole point of the vaccination is that you don't have to wear a mask after vaccination. Like there's a very, but then like the whole point, like once you take the vaccine, you're like 99.9% immune to corona. And I already think that I actually had corona back in 2020, but you still see these people who are saying, oh no, still berating people for not wearing a mask even after they're taking the vaccines. It's like, do you guys not trust the vaccine? It's just, I like turning that around on them.
Well, like, all I can say on this subject is, if you want an example of how to deal with a pandemic correctly, look at Japan.
Oh,
if you want an example of how to deal with a pandemic incorrectly, just look at the Democrat states in the United States and look at multiple European countries, and I'll leave you at that.
Yep.
And it still makes me laugh.
South Korea and Norway, or Sweden and South Korea, I think did pretty good.
No, Sweden did horrendous, contrary to what certain people say.
Sweden was it Finland? Horrendous. One of the Scandinavian countries did okay, I thought.
No, Sweden people looked as a model, but they were unbelievably reckless. And a certain Sweden YouTuber I do follow, he's interviewed. not PewDiePie. The guy you may know of him. He's known as Angry Foreigner.
Mm-hmm.
He did a video speaking with a doctor who blew the whistle on what was going on in care homes, and he had to flee. He had to flee Sweden to go to Denmark. he had to basically be a refugee. He had to go to Denmark to seek refugee status from his own country in Sweden for blowing the whistle. He was basically like the Edward Snowden of the medical field in Sweden, quite literally. And but yeah, it's been an utter joke, and it's been so blown out of proportion when you actually break it down. When you ultimately break it down,
there's a lot of the people who've gotten COVID. It's been, and don't get me wrong, it's terrible, and I'm not diminishing it in any way. The death tolls are it's probably not quite as high as it is, because there's probably some false positives coming in, or there was something else. But a lot of these is a lot of the people were had either pre-existing conditions, or there's actually a disproportional amount of people who've died from COVID who were not old, were obese.
Well, it's funny. It was funny, and I don't want to sound like I'm copying Steve Crowder here, but the numbers are so blatantly over fucking blown. It is not even funny.
No, I don't want to. Let's not talk about that, because I don't want the censors to.
Yeah. Okay. But I'm just going to say.
But I know what you mean.
I'm going to drop one little statistic on you. In 2019, according to the NHS, around 78,000 people died from smoking.
Yeah.
But there's no numbers for 2020.
Exactly. Oh, that's fair. And then you also have people who may have had COVID but died of something else, or that COVID may have exasperated something else that they had.
It's funny you mention that, because I do know in a chat I'm in, somebody found a link where it was a Freedom of Information request in terms of the NHS Scotland. And the request was, how many people died of COVID with no underlying symptoms? And the report and the article stated that they were told that only less than 600 people in Scotland died purely from the coof.
I can believe that.
But according to the numbers that you'll find on the government website, around 12,000 odd people have died. But that 600 number is specifically between March 2020 to January 2021.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to break that down, to provide my numbers are okay, that means around 5%. 5% of people who, quote unquote, died of SARS 2.0 actually died from SARS 2.0.
And then another thing could also be, and this is just a hypothesis. This isn't me trying to say that this is definitive. Again, YouTube, just if you hear me right now, just know that we both think COVID is serious. We both
we're just sourcing authentic information that we
and just stating just observations that we've seen. Just stating the observations. We're not taking a side or anything. But either way, I've also noticed the flu, the percent, because there is a consistent number of reported flu deaths every year. That was significantly lower this year as well. Yeah.
I mean, it's just blatantly obvious that the evidence do not follow the consensus. But it's too busy, because, especially over here, they were trying to make themselves look like they're doing something by basically utterly screwing our economy. To give you some perspective.
I think it's possible Trump could have had a better chance of winning if he had actually handled COVID competently.
But well, here's the thing. Here's the thing with Trump, right? And this is what a lot of people in America don't quite understand. Here's the thing. Donald Trump was correct to try and impose a travel ban.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
100% agree. This is not, honestly, this is not the time for COVID. Global pandemic's not the time for immigration or vacation or anything.
Yeah. But what frustrates me is that he should have done it sooner, because I can tell you for a fact, Japan and South Korea terminated all international travel back in January 2020.
Yep.
All international travel. So can you imagine if you, I don't know, let's say you decide to go on holiday to Tokyo in December 2019, and you had to leave in February 2020. Guess what? You couldn't leave because of this change. Yep. But thankfully, from what I spoke to Japanese people vloggers who, from what I heard from vloggers who live in Japan, like Sharla and abroad in Japan, they straight up stated that people who were stuck there wouldn't get screwed over because of the violating their stay, quote unquote, because of extraordinary circumstances, which is fair from the Japanese government. But on Donald Trump, he should have been more aggressive on the travel ban, and he should not have just held China. He should have done it as a complete international travel ban.
Yeah, well, I agree. And the thing is, and I know some people were saying it, trying to make it sound like it was, and I do admit, like, there has been like a rise in sort of, I guess, sort of anti Asian sentiment in the United States. However, I do think that some of it, I mean, it's definitely good to be. I think it's important. We should be skeptical of. I mean, for instance, people from the Chinese mainland, like, who are just coming, not citizens, mind you, because I do think that that blaming or trying to insinuate that somehow like Asian American citizens are the problem, which they are not. They are Americans. However, there is definitely a reason to be skeptical of people who are from mainland China and have a history of working like with the CCP, especially. Definitely, it's not at all a racial thing. It should not be seen as racial as some people are seeing it. Like, I know you've had attacks on some, like, even people who are like Japanese American, which is absolutely like.
Well, yeah, bonkers. But we all know who's doing the freaking attacks in question, but the media won't be honest about because it's all hush hush.
Yeah, but then also, I mean, China did lie and people did die. Yeah. Like that is true. Like, most of this is like, yeah, we could have handled it better in the West, 100%. But at the same time, this was China. They're coming out with. There's evidence that I'm not going to say it was intentional or not, because we have no way of knowing. But and I've been saying this from the beginning. It was probably created in the Wuhan lab. I said that. Like, I was one of the first people who said that. I was called a conspiracy theorist. But now there's evidence coming out from even CNN and The Guardian are reporting on this now. Finally.
No, well, it's not recent evidence. There was evidence of this with the whistleblowers.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. Well, what I should be saying is finally they're coming around to start reporting it, because they've realized that it's maybe they should, in order for the sake of their credibility.
Well, yeah, but it's like that. Quite often we're just ahead of the curve. I mean, if you want a hilarious recent example, look at Lauren Southern with Allah is Gay. With a Muslim pride parade planned in the United Kingdom.
Oh God, I thought she was banned from the UK.
She is, quote unquote, but on BS grounds, and really she should have sued them, and she would have won.
Either way, okay. So real quick, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. I know basically people were salty that kind of Boris won. A lot of people made false equivalencies between Trump and Boris, simply because they both vaguely, they don't even really look alike, but just because they vaguely both have funny blonde hair and are kind of a little bit overweight. And then because he was also seen, some of the populists voted for him, even though he's definitely not a populist. He's basically a synthesis between a One Nation Tory and a Thatcherite. But
One Nation Toryism is an oxymoron.
Well, what they call One Nation Toryism. Maybe that's a
I like to call it neo-lib / neoconservative paint over communism. Next.
Yeah, but then also on foreign policy, a little less aggressive, and then also socially, like, libertarian. But
not really.
I mean, when I say socially libertarian, I mean like fine with like gay people and like socially liberal. Maybe that's a better way of putting it.
Well, yeah, but to be fair, many toffs in high society are homosexuals anyway.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, they have a term in private toff schools called fagging. Now, before anyone,
probably
before
shouldn't say that.
Okay, I should say they have a term called, which we refer to in Britain as a Lancashire meatball, where they basically have people in lower classes act as their servants. But either way,
I know they have that, like some like old fraternities and dinner clubs apparently have these weird initiation ritual. Like, wasn't there something about David Cameron? Basically, like had to do something with a dead pig, or
well, there was a so-called statement coming out from someone who was angry at Cameron, claiming that he did questionable things to a pig's head. However, it was never proven.
It was just
one of those statements to get trending on like Twitter, and then it disappeared and never be spoken of.
And then people were making comparisons to the national anthem as the TV special. Remember, I don't know if you've seen it, but it was from 2011 from the anthology, what was it? Black Mirror, the anthology show.
Possibly,
where the prime minister had to do it with a pig if they were going to release the princess who was being held hostage. But either way, getting off topic though, but going to Boris, like what's interesting is like the amount of people who were on the left, like old Labor, or even people who were people who were like New Labor, who basically Boris it wasn't so much that the Conservatives and Boris Johnson got elected so much as it was people voted against Jeremy Corbyn because everyone hates Jeremy Corbyn. Except what's funny, the white nationalists in the UK endorsed Jeremy Corbyn, which was kind of funny.
No, they don't. They despise Corbyn.
Some of them did because they thought he was better than Boris.
Well, here's the thing. Maybe some quote-unquote white nationalists, and I find the term white nationalism utterly retarded, because white is not a nation, first of all. So
it's more of an American phenomenon. It really only works within the context of United States.
But even then, it just proves that Americans do what they constantly do and butcher my language, and they need to be punished for it. But more on that in this very soon. But the only ones I find who would quote unquote back Jeremy Corbyn is mainly on the JQ, but that's a whole nother subject.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so Boris, I mean, there are really no world leaders. There are really no world leaders I particularly like or severely admire. But by default, I think my two quote unquote favorites would be Boris and Macron at the moment. Like,
I mean, how can I put this? In terms of leaders I want to slap around the back of the head over the ones I know of, Boris Johnson's right at the top of the iceberg. Macron is the epitome of, he's perhaps the number one epitome, other than maybe Hillary Clinton in 2016, as the establishment candidate.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, it made me laugh when people at The Guardian tried claiming that Macron was an outsider, and I'm just he was a banker at Goldman Sachs, who was and I use this term in a very specific context, who was groomed by the establishment to take over.
Yeah, well, I can see that. Yeah.
I mean, that's what he was there for. And as for the subject of Macron's wife, if I were to be leader of the country, one thing I would do that would really rile up Macron is to point out to the fact that his wife is a dirty predator.
I know she is quite a bit older than him, but I mean, he's French, so I mean, French like weird things. That's all.
I'm just saying this right now. She was his teacher. He was 15. She was 40, and I'll leave it at that.
Oh, okay. Let's leave it at that then.
We're not Vorsh. We don't promote that stuff.
No, we aren't. But either way, so
before I finish, sorry to interrupt. One thing I will say about Boris Johnson, the amount of lefties I knew at school who loved Boris Johnson when he was running for mayor and when he was mayor of London, to utterly despising him when it came to Brexit, is numerous. And I remember one of them tried getting in contact with me saying, "Oh, you must love Boris." I'm like, "No, I hate him even more now than I did when I was at school." And they're like, "What?" And they can't wrap their head around it.
Honestly, probably one of the biggest face palms I've seen was, this is when he was, I think, foreign minister. He was foreign minister, right? I think
might have been at one point.
I think it was.
I think it was when
Cameron.
I think it was in it was Theresa May took over. Yeah, he became foreign minister. Yeah.
So yeah, he went to he had some diplomatic assignment or something in Myanmar, and he went there, and he was like, basically, he gave a speech about just the great tradition and the international friendship or whatever between like Myanmar and other South Asian cultures and the United Kingdom, and just like, oh, how unity is great. Just very traditional kind of like liberal, like what you'd expect, basically a liberal speech about a different country to be.
Wishy-washy, yeah.
And then he ended it on what I would say is a really nice note, probably literally the most poetic note I could think of. I think it's probably the best thing that any Western or Anglo-American leader or diplomat could do who's on a state visit to Myanmar. He recited off the top of his head Mandalay by Rudyard Kipling, and probably my favorite modern poem of all time. Other than maybe Robert Burns' Auld Lang Syne, but yeah. So Mandalay, of course, we both know Mandalay. Rudyard Kipling. So he recited it, and then guess what? Oh God, who was it? It may have been The Guardian, or it was one of those larger British, like center left rag. Do you know what they did in response to that?
Let me guess. Something to do with branding him racist?
Yeah, exactly. They said for reciting Mandalay, which is an ode to just the beauty and of the East, basically, and very, very like thoughtful poem, I'd say, about, because I mean, Kipling, of course, he wrote a lot about other cultures and was very fond of other cultures, and he was like a liberal proto-multiculturalist, basically. But either way, and then they call him racist for that.
Yeah.
And it's like they're just looking for something to smear about. It's like basically they're trying to cancel art and poetry and all that stuff now. Even though these are literally the people who unironically and unintentionally, without realizing it, basically support the concept of the white man's burden.
Yeah.
But
yeah, they can all F off with that crap.
One last thing on Boris, though, just wanted to say, kind of an observation, and I think you can see it with most leaders too who run on a particular platform. You see it in Trump, who ran on a populist platform, and then a populist platform, and then basically about 2 years in became like pretty kind of like centrist-y establishment, not in rhetoric but in policy. And then you saw it with Reagan in late 70s, early 80s, who again ran as sort of a Goldwater style classical liberal almost, and he even claimed to be a libertarian in a interview with Reason in like 75, and then ended up becoming just a liberal internationalist, like with neoliberal economic policies. And then you also saw it with I think I'm trying to think of other, maybe it's not worth thinking of other examples, but you see it with and then Obama, who ran to the left, like all Democrats tend to do, ran to the left of where he actually was, and then ended up just being a continuation of the Bush presidency in a lot of ways.
Especially in foreign policy.
Especially in foreign policy. And then you accept harsher on immigration. But then you see, and then you saw Boris, and I'm not going to go so far as to call Boris a libertarian, because he definitely isn't in the American sense. But I will say he presented himself sort of as a kind of classical liberal adjacent, and with the exception of the NHS, because that's a sacred cow for both parties in the UK. But he almost tried to
you shall not criticize.
Yeah, he tried to present himself as sort of like a John Stuart Mill type 19th century kind of liberal, and he even I know he cited Mill as like somebody. He quoted Mill in relation to Brexit, because Mill was a liberal nationalist who definitely would have supported Brexit. But he did that. He sort of ran on sort of like as far as the UK is concerned, what would be over there a quote unquote limited government, or the closest thing to that as possible. And then he's basically now governing as, he also had a populist bent, of course, but then he ended up, now he's just, now there's pretty much no distinction between him and Joe Biden on policy or rhetoric or anything like that. Like, I don't see very much difference between, like, they're much closer to each other than Boris ever was to Trump. And Boris definitely likes Biden more too.
Well, yeah, but then again, Boris, like I said, Boris is a clown who stands for nothing. I mean, if I were to sum up Boris Johnson as a president, I imagine of a Monty Python skit of a shitlib.
Fair enough. I actually do think, and of course it's not as good as the original, but I actually think I actually find it entertaining, but especially because it's actually, unlike like SNL, which is like woke comedy these days. This one actually, it actually is making fun of both sides. But the revival of Spitting Image, which actually in the US is for free on YouTube, because I think it's on BritBox in the UK, but that's not available in the US, so they're just releasing them for free on YouTube every week. But their caricature of Boris Johnson's absolutely hilarious and extremely accurate. Actually, at least watching the Boris Johnson clips, especially the ones with Dominic Cummings, are funny. But it's not even a parody. Like, it's actually, they're just depicting Boris Johnson. But the funny thing is also, Boris Johnson, I think, is eligible to run for US president because he was born in New York City.
Yeah, he was. And so technically speaking, we have a literal immigrant running a country.
Yeah, I think his parents were UK citizens, though. I think they were just there.
Yeah, both his parents were born in the UK, although his grandfather was Turkish.
Really?
Yeah, his grandfather was Turkish.
That's interesting. In fact, I did not guess that. I know, does he have Russian in there somewhere? Because he's like a Russian middle name, and then Boris, or maybe Ukraine, something like that.
Possibly, but I do know his grandfather was Turkish, which is why I jokingly said that. This is why I jokingly said that Boris Johnson, because then he's like 12.5% Turk, should be able to either A, make a good kebab, B, be a good barber, or C, just be massively inconsistent when it comes to homosexuality in Islam.
Yeah, he's basically trying to. I know his biggest influence is like Churchill, and he actually wrote a fairly decent book on Winston Churchill and leadership.
I do know of the book in question, but like it was more of a love. It was much more of a love letter. But then again, people say, "Oh, you could be like Churchill." I'm like, no, Churchill, if he met Boris Johnson, would have disowned him. He would disown him more than a disappointed father would.
Yeah, it would have basically seen him like he would have probably put him in a useful position. Kind of in the same reason where, like, you see Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars puts the kind of that, but then I'm talking more like the finding a spot for kind of remember the sequel trilogy. We're not going to get into how that disaster, but remember the Admiral, the guy with the red hair.
Oh yeah.
Who's actually, fun fact, that's my friend's cousin, the actor.
Oh, lucky you.
Yeah, but kind of like he was just a bumbling kind of buffoon, and he was a self-aware parody of basically what the officers were in the original trilogy, which I thought was kind of a funny touch. But basically, he was useful in. Palpatine said at some point, like, "Oh, he's useful where he is, but he can also be controlled. He's good at these like few things, and then he's easily controlled. So that's why I have him there." That's probably what Churchill would do to Johnson.
Possibly, yes. Or he'll just throw him out of the freaking building and tell him to clean himself up.
Yeah.
And call him a street rat.
Anyway, so coming to the end, we've gone over quite a bit longer than I would have liked, but let's end with you talking about your policy proposals for the future of the United Kingdom and the Anglosphere in general.
Okay, so where should I begin? Oh, when I've quote unquote taken office? Or
Yes.
where we've had a quote unquote insurrection of the monarchy in Parliament?
Sure. Let's do that.
Okay, so
or
now
let's say here setting up. Brexit has been relatively successful. Prince Charles becomes king, but then after Elizabeth dies, Parliament gets even crazier. King Charles amends Parliament, or like goes into Parliament and kind of just takes over, does what technically he's allowed to do. That causes controversy, and then from the ashes you rise, and then basically you pull a Francis Urquhart from the House of Cards books / miniseries from the 90s, if you've seen that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say I take office, and I say that King Charles gives me the title Supreme Emperor because he can't be dealing with that crap because he's 80 years old. He's stupid. He's really old. I'm like, King Charles. Okay, where do you want me to start though? Because I've got multiple policies.
Start with just the general ones, I guess. Like, actually, start with what policies would you first use to just stabilize it? Your initial day one orders.
Okay. Well, the first thing I got to do is completely renegotiate the Brexit agreement.
Okay.
I go to the European Parliament behind closed doors, and I'm looking one offer that they can't refuse to whoever the leader of the European Union is, and I get the most pro-bias, funny ginger, the most pro-bias Britain deal that the world has ever seen. So much so that Donald Trump hears about this after being acquitted for like the 100th time, re-releases his book Art of the Deal. So I get my deal from the European Union. The big talking points that is leaked to the press is that the European Union the European Union has repatriated the United Kingdom a small bill of £350 trillion.
Okay.
And I'm going to settle this European question because there's still lots of baggage with a winner-take-all referendum. My deal versus pure Remain. We have the referendum. 6 months later, my deal wins by a giant landslide. And then we start off what I'd like to call the 4 stages of moralization. Now, that might sound familiar to you.
Yeah, I get the reference.
Yes, the counter-Uri plan, as I like to call it. Now we're going to start with the moralization. This bill is the start of the moralization, where I'm stamping my giant right boot on the effectively the continent of Europe, effectively putting them in their place for the crimes of Marxism, National Socialism, and fascism. And making reference to the fact that the Brits, provided the world liberalism, as well as us being the true enlightened people of Europe. Basically, proper arrogant typist talk. Now I completely restructured the entire economic policy to be much more towards manufacturing and national capitalism. But with the giant Brexit bill, I go through not to do the Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau style of Build Back Better crap. I would implement the largest rebuild policy the world has ever seen. And this is going to take me, with relentless effort and relentless will, about 25 to 30 years to pull off. The restructuring I'm talking rebuilding the entire telecommunications from the ground up, the entire the entire railway network, the entire automotive manufacturing industry, as well as building brand new facilities such as Gen 4 nuclear power plants, complete aerospace manufacturing bases, so on and so forth, to make the entire country agriculturally, energy, and militaristically independent of the entire world.
Okay. And then what about like social policy?
Okay, social policies. Well, this one would really piss off many of the women and feminists out there, but I'm going to make the entire education system entirely biased towards boys, and I'm going to make child custody laws very biased towards men and fathers.
Interesting. I definitely 100%. I wouldn't go that far. Basically, I mean, I definitely think it's more, especially at least in the U.S. Unfortunately, leans more towards to favor women. However, like for instance, I'd at least do if the woman cheats on the man, unless maybe in like the one instance if the man is like incredibly like abusive or degenerate or something, in which case the cheating is still wrong. But either way, I digress. With the exception of maybe that situation, man does not have to pay any alimony at all whatsoever, and favors custody towards him.
Well, the reason I say that is because, to point out a statistical anomaly, kids who stay with their mothers compared to their fathers are vastly more likely to end up in jail, drug addicts, suicide victims, or to be abused/killed by their mothers compared to their fathers. So
sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Children who live with their mothers are more likely to be abused/murdered by their mothers, as long as becoming drug addicts, suicide victims, and criminals.
Is there a statistic for that? I'm not saying that you're necessarily wrong. That just
it's very hard to find, because I remember looking into this. There is huge statistical trend data from the United States and in the UK showing that single fathers don't have the problem single mothers do.
I can see that in the case of like at least those in poverty. So I can see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
It just sounds a little reductionist. Like, I mean, I think there's always more nuance than.
Well, the thing is that this is a statistical trend I found, and I'm like, well, if this is I mean, because I don't buy the poverty equals crime malarkey. That has been debunked and ripped apart already. It should be disregarded from the current consensus. But going back to the whole thing about children and parenting, one thing I'm going to do, which will really annoy the conservatives, and especially, I'm going to, ironically enough, reinforce the actual terms and conditions of marriage, even though I'm not religious.
Okay.
So by that, as in things like no-fault divorces are abolished. You can only get
definitely. Divorce should definitely be disincentivized. I do agree with that.
You can only get divorced if it's through adultery or abuse. That's it. If you because I mean it's been years since I've been debated. If you're I don't know, one of you becomes it's a terminal illness, not grounds for a divorce. One of you loses your job because of economic reasons, not grounds for a divorce. So I make it so make it so difficult to get a divorce that more and more people who think about getting married are going to now have to really consider if they really want to get married or not. It's one of the oldest forms of contract law we have in terms of mankind.
Okay.
And it's become a joke. And me, because I'm all about the honor when it comes to mankind, you sign the contract, you honor the terms and conditions of said contract.
Okay. Fair enough.
No compromise. Another aspect. What's it called? One thing I'm going to do, something that this country and also especially America should have done years ago, I'm ending the war on drugs and going all in on drug liberation and to roll in all that tax money.
I can get behind that. I don't. I'm iffy on the tax part, but maybe pragmatically speaking, I can. I definitely the drug legalization. Agree with you there. And then plus you could even make the free market, like a free market argument too. Like, yeah, like let's say you have these people who are addicted to like opiates and that sort of thing. When the market's very innovative. What if at some point they're able to create something like that? You feel the effects, like basically the same effects of that, but it's like not addictive or dangerous or something in low doses. That's possible. Like that's just throwing something out there. I don't know how possible that is. I'm not a chemist or anything, but like I can see that being a possibility.
It's definitely possible. I mean, we know this with the Netherlands, we know this with Portugal, etc. But slight spin I'll have on it is that have you by any chance seen the film The Gentleman?
I have not.
Okay, and Darth Kelton's just commented that I was raised by a single father. I do say it is far superior than single motherhood quality. I mean, maybe that's confirmation bias there, but
my stance on that is both parents. You need a father figure and a mother figure, and children who have both statistically turn out the best.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like I'm not in favor of the destruction of the nuclear family. Hell no. I mean, when my parents split, like I say this right now, I was an absolute little child born to unmarried parents with my mother. But as soon as I was living with my dad, I was one of the best behaved boys there was around. Because I knew full well if I tried that stuff with my old man, he'll put me in my place, in the politest context.
Mm-hmm.
But going back to the drugs thing, have you by any chance seen the film The Gentleman?
I have not. It sounds familiar though.
Oh, it's the most recent Richard. What I'm saying, Guy Ritchie movies. It stars Matthew McConaughey, Charlie Hunnam, Hugh Grant, and a couple of others.
It's still like the title sounds familiar, but I have not seen it.
It came out 2 years ago. Well, basically, the film.
Maybe if I saw like the poster or the trailer, it looked familiar, but I have not.
Okay,
I'll look at it later. But
okay, yeah, I could get you a link to a trailer. Hold on.
But I'll watch it after the stream. So
sure thing. But to give you a summary of the plot, basically, Matthew McConaughey plays an American drug lord is maybe not quite the right term, but he basically runs a highly successful super skunk organization that racks in millions upon millions of pounds. He wants to sell it to a fellow guy who's big in underground drug smuggling for a price. But things start going messy, and he has to find out who the hell is trying to undermine his industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so on, and the plot goes from there. When I was thinking of the sort of numbers that they reference in the film about how much money they could make off this, a little light bulb popped in my head. Like, why not we have our own, with the legalization, have our own super skunk industry and become the monopoly sellers of super skunk, especially to like Europe and America, and dare I say, start the quote unquote restart the opium wars with China with this substance.
Interesting.
Because I'm such an evil man.
Also, I just want to say, going to insert real quick. The UK, Hong Kong, the UK should have just sold it to the US.
Well, hey, we should never really given that up in context, but anyway, that's a whole nother topic. So that's the drug policy. When it comes to education, I want to restructure the entire education system to be STEM bias. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics.
That's the one. I'm not going to like push back or debate it because we really are short for time. But but I'm just all I'm going to say is as important as I do think those things are, I am 100% against making it biased towards those things.
Okay, the reason why I say make it biased is because of the advancements with technology, the incoming fourth industrial revolution, and the way I'm setting up my economy. I'm going to need it very biased towards those systems, because I'm going to massively reindustrialize the island overall, as well as bringing in expanding certain technologies that we have to expand our foothold in other technologies, for instance, aerospace. I want to expand our, so I'm going to need an education much more biased built towards that. But also, generally, a complete restructure of the education system, a much more higher emphasis on physical health, because Jesus Christ, the amount of obesity there is on this island is utterly shocking.
Really? Yeah, no, I can see that. I mean, you guys,
we're not that actually. If you take into account per capita rates, we're actually not that. We're actually quite close to America,
and that's why this whole thing of the whole fat acceptance thing is so dangerous.
It's ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous.
It's definitely contributed to if it weren't here and we actually quote unquote fat shamed. And I don't mean like making fun of somebody who's fat at the gym trying to lose weight, because that's just being a dick. Because that person's obviously trying. But basically saying, what they call fat shaming now is like if a doctor says, "Hey, maybe you should stand to lose a little bit of weight," or even fitness trainers now are considered fat shamers on TV for stating the fact that obesity is unhealthy, which it objectively is. I mean, you have some people who like they have like problem with their metabolism, so they're larger, but that's only in specific instances, and even then they can still lose weight. But like,
yeah, I mean, I've heard the thyroid claim, and I don't buy it whatsoever.
But either way, so you have what's interesting is Bill Maher, the comedian, who's like he's like leans left on a lot of issues, but he's basically like an old school liberal in the sense where he's just like politically incorrect, like a kind of like like you think of it doesn't matter, but like a George Carlin type.
I love George Carlin.
Yeah, he's like a not as good version of George Carlin, but he's still funny. I watch his show, but he's only late night show. It's even worth it these days. But so he ended up, it's the most based thing ever. And I'm like, oh, maybe this is not the best way to word it, but that's actually why it's kind of based. He was like, fat shaming is good. We need to fat shame more. And he said that like live on air. And he got blasted by like one of those, some I don't know, blog or one of those publications, like millennial publications or whatever. I don't know. May have been like I can't think of it, but like, you know what I mean? Those like sort of, or maybe even Vox. I don't know, something like that.
Wouldn't surprise me, but that's the whole point. So there's that aspect. Let's see. Completely go back to almost the old school ways in terms of fiscal policy. Go back to gold. Abolish fiat currency, scrap Keynesian economics, scrap MMT, but also I will not have I would scrap the ability to print money or quantitative ease.
What about forcefully disband the faculty of the London School of Economics and replace it with like Hayek types?
Well, that's part of what I spoke about restructuring education.
What's funny is it was I know the London School of Economics was founded by both Fabian socialists and classical liberals, and but then it got taken over by like MMT.
Yeah, well, MMT's garbage.
Yeah, it's not. No, it's basically astrology.
Yep, quite literally. Yeah. I mean, MMT basically straight up says that you could be completely economically irresponsible and it's perfectly fine. I would guess it's Greek, but
honestly, it's like it's like Middle Earth Lord of the Rings economics.
That's hilarious. So yeah, there is that. One aspect of the industrialization now this is where I would get lots of hate from certain people. I would buy out a lot of certain British brands which are now under foreign ownership, like for instance a lot of the automotive brands, and I'll put them under one roof, similar to what British Leyland did, except it will be done properly, where basically I own them but I don't technically run them, if that makes sense.
Okay. I mean, it sounds a little corporatist, honestly. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does remind me of like the I'm not, of course, I'm not comparing your system to Mussolini's like as a whole, but I mean, it does sort of remind me of his corporatist model or the sort of
economic
national syndicalism might be a better way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea of this is I buy it out, so I own it. So I'm basically like, imagine hypothetically if Donald Trump bought out Tesla, for instance, and Elon Musk still runs it, but it's just Donald Trump owns it.
Okay.
That type of model, whereas like I'm not necessarily going to dictate what must be made there. All I'm just saying is I'm buying it out. I may ask for certain things, but I don't technically run it.
Okay.
I forget what type of. I know A did a video on this, but it's like they own the company, but I'm not technically the CEO, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's similar to like what Richard Branson does with Virgin, where he's the founder of the company, but he doesn't run it, and he's not the CEO.
Yeah.
So that I would also get Motorsport Valley involved, so we can have the absolute best of the have the best brains in terms of building racing cars, building our road cars.
Who's that one Formula One racer who's like a hypocrite? He's in the UK.
Oh, Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, doesn't he say like a bunch of like woke stuff, but then at the same time he's like has like a private jet and
multiple houses and all that stuff. Yeah, massive hypocrite.
Yeah. I thought I know the new Spitting Image made fun of him too. That's what I know.
Oh yeah. But what made me laugh was back in Christmas 2017, he got loads of flack on social media because of an Instagram video he had of his nephew wearing a dress, and he said, "Boys don't wear dresses."
That's funny.
I'm not joking when I say that, but yeah.
Okay. So want to move on just because I really want to.
I would say really late.
Do you want to end by talking about your foreign policy and your interesting stance on human rights?
Okay, so foreign policy, it's going to be like
attack dog America.
Not quite attack dog America, but basically like I'm going to end up putting a lot of nations in their place. Not necessarily go to war, but I will put, like, for instance, the UN, I'm going to throw all the despot nations, everyone who's on the Human Rights Board, I'm throwing out of a window. Okay? Xi Jinping is going to be put in his place, especially over Hong Kong, and I'm taking that back. And in fact, I'm going to make it clear that Hong Kong's going to colonize China, along with Taiwan.
Well, Taiwan is the real China. So
yeah, I know exactly. So them colonize it. Well, technically, so is Hong Kong because they speak Cantonese.
You just got banned in China, folks.
I don't give a flying fuck. Who cares?
We were probably banned in China long before this.
Oh, who cares anyway? But anyway, maybe by translation, we'll get loads of views and traffic from China anyway. Anyway, so there's that. Just basically disregard lots of internationalist organizations. The UN will be destroyed. NATO's worthless, and the World Trade Organization will be worthless as well.
There's no such thing. The international community is like a myth anyway.
Yeah,
I know. Like literally speaking, it's the world's anarchic. Yeah,
exactly. It's just oligarchies. And as for the whole question of human rights, well, this is where I get very controversial. Human rights will no longer be quote unquote universal. They'll be merely subscription models that people will have to assess and will be made victims of.
Okay. Do you want to give an example?
Okay, let's say
property rights. That's probably the least controversial, I guess, example.
Okay, those who follow ideologies that do not respect private property rights shall have no private property whatsoever.
So forceful, like legally, they are not allowed to have private property, or if they have property and it gets confiscated, that's not going to be protected by law. So do you mean like the government is going to be like, nope, we're not going to let you have property, or if their property is stolen, there's not going to be any intervention? So more laissez-faire or more controlled?
I'll put it this way: if you are Vaush, you're going to end up homeless and butt naked.
Interesting.
And all your capital, assets, and property shall be redistributed for the many, not the few.
Yeah, I mean, if they truly believe in what they say and care about the people, they're going to be fine. They'll be fine with that, right?
Yep, 100%. And well, another subject that's going to really annoy everybody. I'm going to have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to the Middle East.
Okay, so like no, like in terms of like immigration, or do you mean in terms of like terrorism?
I'm more speaking of I am not going to deal with any of the BS when it comes to the Middle East. Whether it be what's going on right now, whether it's about historical things, I'm not dealing with any of that BS. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to add, like in closing, about just, I guess, the state of the modern UK, the future of Britain in general, whether you're positive, you're optimistic or pessimistic, or a little bit of both, and then also reflection on anything else you have to talk about? I'll let you, whatever you want.
Honestly, I'm not optimistic about the future, and I would argue this island can only be saved if I'm made undisputed ruler of it.
Your ideas definitely sound interesting. I disagree with
yeah,
probably about like maybe 40 to 50% of what you said, but I mean the ideas that you have that I do really like.
Well, I mean, like I say, I have a lot of unique takes, which even people I know who are, funny enough, a good friend of mine who's based in America, he's as close as you can get to an ANCAP without actually being an ANCAP. And when I told him about making about the private property thing,
are you talking about Chicago? Are you talking about Chicago?
No. This is somebody I've known for years. But basically, when I spoke to him about the idea, about my point about property rights not being universal, he ironically enough went from full laissez-faire to almost like an aggressive status. Just in the one, just on that conversion, because a lot of what policies are more about, in a sense, trying to restore honor, a sense of honor.
I can definitely agree. I can definitely agree with the sentiment. We definitely need more civic virtue, especially in society. We care so much about rights, but we don't care enough about virtue, and that is.
I mean, me.
Probably
it's not
more
about
important.
Right.
Even. No, I'm just saying virtue. Right. No, I'm just saying our society cares too much about cares more about rights and barely cares about civic virtue. Whereas I'd argue, I'm not saying rights aren't important. I personally believe they are, but I think civic virtue is more important, and that's like what the Greeks and Romans at least understood.
Well, for me, I mean, the whole point about rights is about accountability and You can't. The whole point of rights is it's about responsibility and accountability.
Yeah. Freedom also means freedom to do something or freedom from something does not mean. I mean, no matter how, the one thing that you can never be free from are consequences of your actions, of how you choose to exercise that freedom. There's always going to be a consequence. So, and I don't mean to say it in because I know you have leftists, especially with regards to free speech, are saying, "Oh, freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from." I don't mean it in that sense, but I just mean it in the literal sense. Every action is a consequence, and you have to stick by that consequence if you exercise that freedom. Yeah,
that's very true. But like I said, ultimately speaking, those who do not value their right to do something shall not miss their right being removed from them.
Okay, that's. I mean, from that's a philosophically sound statement. So you're definitely consistent, and I 100% respect that. And your subscription model is interesting, and to an extent, at least morally speaking, I can get behind some of that. But either way,
yeah, sure thing.
Thank you so much. What were you saying?
I was just going to say, like I said, this is just something I've thought of in recent times, and it's definitely an idea which is very, from what I understand, very unique in terms of world politics. Like, if you heard, I don't know, Donald Trump come out of this, everyone would be like, "What the earth is he talking about?"
Mm-hmm.
And I do think we're going to get to a point, personally, not saying my ideas are going to become the thing, but I do think we're going to get to a point, maybe in the next 5 or 10 years, where people are going to naturally segregate. Maybe not segregate is not the right word, but there's going to be questions about the concept of universalism versus accountability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And human rights, in reality, universal right. I've always said that whole concept, that the whole concept of like multiculturalism, universalism, human rights. Those are like some of those ideas are the epitome, like they are the apotheosis of Eurocentrism.
Yeah,
because it's like how it is very Eurocentric to presume that basically what Western values are universal values.
Except they're not.
Exactly. It's just you have different cultures which see the world in different ways. They do, I guess, what works for them. I mean, some things might be. We'll get into that, I guess, another time. But yeah. I mean, it's true. I mean, it all has to do with how we understand the world. There are some things that are just not natural to other cultures. It's not a good thing. It's a bad thing. That's just how it is. It's how we make sense of the world. And honestly, it makes things. I would not want a single global culture. It makes things less interesting.
No, because at the end of the day, I would not like Japan is the way it is because of the Japanese. America is the way it is because of the Americans. England is the way it is because of the English, and vice versa.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, yeah, we should definitely go.
Yeah, I agree. Do you have any plugs you want to give before we get going?
But obviously, as you were kind enough to host me, please do like and subscribe to the Politicrat. He's almost on 500. Let's go to 1,000. Normally, when I show, you get subs. Myself, I am obviously, those who know me, I am the co-host of Yiz the Eunuch. Please, if you are aware of her, please do go see her, and she will be doing a video with me as co-host tomorrow with D Grant, who was a guest on Seal of Approval, who actually got interviewed midstream by the police. Not even joking.
Oh, wow, that's an experience.
But also, yes. So obviously, please do like, share, and subscribe, and please comment and please paste in the comments anything you agree or disagree with my takes.
Thank you so much for. Sorry.
Oh, and I was just going to say, and also, if you like what I have to say and want me to be leader of the United Kingdom, what position would you like to hold? I'm sure I can make a space for you.
All right. Again, thank you so much for shilling for me, number one, and thank you again so much for coming on, especially last notice. Again, the person who's going to come on, we could talk about the same thing, had to cancel. But either way, thank you everybody for watching. This is Supreme Emperor Kizza here to talk about what we just talked about. But yeah, anyway, I hope everybody has a fantastic evening, and I will see you again soon. And hopefully, Kizza, I'll have you back on again. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good evening, everybody.
the skies, serves not to root thy native own. With matchless beauty crowned, and